Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything, because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my grandfather had moved in with us, as my fastidiously protective mother claimed, with the threat of coronavirus sweeping the nation. Many elderly people were succumbing to the virus. She felt a great deal more secure knowing that Gramps was tucked away safely under our roof, out of harm's way. "I don't trust those nursing homes," she exclaimed. "Never have, never will. I'm sorry, but we really must insist that Gramps moves in with us." At first my Gramps was hesitantly reluctant to move in with us, claiming he didn't want to be a burden, and that sooner or later we would get so sick of him we would be begging him to leave. "Nonsense," my mother had exclaimed. "We could never get sick of you, Gramps." Regretfully, when Gramps moved into the bedroom suite on the lower wing of our double-storey house, we really knew little about him, as he had been living in a retirement home in Nebraska. We currently reside in Oklahoma, which is situated on the south central and southern plains of the states, bordering Texas, where we live in the pretty suburb of Nicholas Hills. It was only on very sporadic occasions or isolated celebratory events, like Thanksgiving and Christmas, that we ever saw our grandfather. We considered him to be a congenial man, but in truth we barely knew him at all. It was as if he was swept in and out of our lives like a feather blowing in the wind. If I'm being blatantly honest and very candid, I know it sounds inconsiderate, cold-blooded and callous, but I never warmed to the idea of the elderly man moving into our home, as I thought it would cramp my style. I'm about 22, and I doubted that, taking into consideration the huge generation gap between us, that we would have anything in common. I was to find out I couldn't be more wrong. My grandfather may have been wearing an older biological suit than mine, but other than that, he was not much different to myself. He was worldly wise, astute, perceptive, and very discerning, much more so than me. By all accounts, it would appear that throughout his tempestuous life he had gone through experiences that could teach me a thing or two about life. I have come to appreciate that older people can definitely help you avoid making the mistakes they did when they were your age. So it goes without saying that before long I began to enjoy having my Gramps around, as he became my very best friend. One day when it was raining cats and dogs outside, I was sitting with my Gramps on the opposite side of the kitchen table, tapping into my cell phone to connect with social media, while my grandfather was reading a Stephen King novel. I glanced out of the window to see the rain bucketing down, gushing down the drain pipes, while the baby cypress and black walnut trees in our front yard glittered with the silvery raindrops. The air was filled with the refreshing scent of petrichor. "Do you like scary novels?" I asked my Gramps, eyeing his Stephen King book beadily, that was so large it looked to be the size of a brick. "I mean, Stephen King, he writes some really grisly stuff, doesn't he? I do remember watching his gripping movie, Pet Sematary, wasn't it? Oh, it gave me the chills. I think a dog came to life or something." My grandfather stroked his moustache reflectively, putting down his book on the table. "You know what, son? You're absolutely right. I don't know why. Maybe the scare gives me some kind of a thrill, like you get when you go skydiving on a plane. Of course, it's intrinsically different when you experience a horror for yourself. Quite different then." So what was the scariest thing that ever happened to you, Gramps, in your long life? Have you ever been seriously scared?
Oh, I've been scared a few times, said my grandfather.
But you haven't got a story as gripping to tell me as your Stephen King novel, I challenged cheekily.
Well, I might not have a Stephen King story to tell you, but I do have a story that you would consider quite exceptional. It happened to me a long time ago, when I was a young boy living in Tennessee in 1954, when I was 12 years old. Do you want to hear it? Go on, I said, putting down my cell phone. I'm all ears.
And this was the story he told me. Believe me, nothing prepared me for this. I grew up in a small wooden cabin in the Tennessee mountains. It was a very tough life. Life was hard in those days. Money was in short supply for us. However, for most under Eisenhower, the American economy was booming very nicely, thank you very much. But for those of us living in Tennessee, you could see we were left behind, almost forgotten, caught up in the debris of our impoverished lives, a fly in a spider's web. My mother had 3 children, but my 2 sisters were between the ages of 3 and 4, while I was 12, so obviously I was a lot older at the time. We had a good life, despite our lack of financial advantages, as when you grow up in poverty, you manage to adapt. You find resourceful ways to entertain yourself. I spent much of my time playing out in the woods, looking for insects under rocks, throwing rocks into the creek, even using my father's wood-carving tools to make all kinds of wooden ornaments and toys. I made things like wooden fishes, horses, dogs, even bowls for my mother. You know, that sort of thing. I did have a friend called Louis McGruman that would sometimes play with me, but a lot of the time I was left to my own devices. So I had to be resourceful, industrious if you like. My mother liked me playing outdoors. She loathed me getting under her feet, as our cabin wasn't exactly very big. The one thing I did realise was how lucky I was to live in this part of the world. I assure you, once you live in a place like Tennessee, it gets under your skin, as the place never ever leaves you. It stays with you. It is the birthplace of country music, convivial church communities, whiskey, hot spicy chicken, barbecue, and so much more. It's the golden sunsets, fertile valleys, tree-covered ridges, streams, gorges, rolling hills, exquisite mountains, transfixing beautiful views, and very crisp, fresh mountain air that can steal your breath away. At the time, my father was working for a local cattle rancher, helping him manage his illustrious cattle herd. He hired 2 farm hands to help him on his ranch. One of them was my father. One day 3 of his cows went missing, vanished into thin air, never to be seen again. The other farm hand that worked with my father told the cattle rancher that my dad had secretly confessed to him that he had stolen the cattle, which of course was a bald-faced lie. This provocative, inflammatory revelation meant that my father got the sack. The tragedy was he really needed that job, so he was so devastated. When he returned home, he was a crumbling heap of melancholia. I can still rewind that moment in time as if it was yesterday. You see, there are some things that leave an indelible mark or impression in your life, things you're meant to remember, as maybe within the intrinsic core of the memory lies an ineffaceable, deep-rooted, authentic lesson that needs to be learnt. On this unfading, impressionable occasion, my mother and I were seated at the kitchen table, having eaten some cheesy mashed potatoes and baked beans, although I noticed she was fidgeting with her food, barely eating a thing. The overwrought expression upon her face was anguished, doleful, desolate. My 2 little sisters were tucked up in bed, obliviously unaware of my mother's rising level of anxiety. We had 4 single beds all parked right next to each other, in the furthest corner of the cabin, which was really one large room, a bedroom, a kitchen, a living room, all rolled into one. Open-plan living at its most contained, you could say. So forget privacy, for we had none of that. It was about as simplistic, facile and rudimentary as it gets, but my mother, bless her cotton socks, made the inside of that cabin pretty and quirky. She was always on the lookout for little bargains to transform our cabin into a cosy nest. Believe me, that woman was a natural interior designer. She could make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. And even with her minimalistic wardrobe, every Sunday when she turned up for church, she looked like she'd stepped out of a bandbox. She was so well turned out. I remember my mother apprehensively kept looking at the clock. She was continuously sighing. "Oh, where is he? Where is he?
Why is he so late?" She was working herself into a frenzy, tapping her fingers on the table. It was dark outside. My father wasn't back. This was most unlike him. I watched my mother pacing up and down the cabin floor like a wild cat in a zoo enclosure. She looked heartily relieved when finally my father walked through the cabin door. Her furrowed brow visibly relaxed, her tight, stiff posture loosened, her frenzied demeanour became calm. Suffice to say, the man that returned home to us that evening was not the same man who had left for his job earlier in the morning, with a joyful skip to his gait. This was not the father I was well acquainted with, the man who would come and thump me on the back, patting my mane of blonde curls, saying, "How you doing, son? How's your day been? Did you have lots of fun?" Instead, his comportment was so downcast, his head was focusing on the floor, avoiding any form of eye contact with us, while his body literally sagged like a drooping flower in the meadow. He looked wilted, dishevelled, ashamed, embarrassed. My mother rushed towards him, enveloping his fragmented, flagging body in her arms. "Thank God you're all right, Archibald Blanchard. I thought something quite dreadful had happened to you. I was worried out of my skin. You're so late this evening. You should have been back ages and ages ago. What on earth happened to you?" "I lost my job," he said, looking at her, through the saddest eyes I've ever seen. "Farmer Bryce has given me the sack." For a moment she could have cut the silence with a knife, as my mother tried to assimilate what my father had told us. This was a monumental deal, as without his job, things were going to get exceedingly tough for all of us. We were barely making ends meet in the first place, so relying on my father's wage was the only thing keeping our heads above water. This horrifying revelation could quite literally sink us, driving us into the depths of even greater financial impoverishment. "But I don't understand. Why would he do that? Why would he blatantly lie to Farmer Bryce like that? Why would he do that? What is wrong with him? It's so duplicitous. It's so wrong. It's just disgusting." "He did that, sweetheart, to cover his tracks. I think it's because he is the one that stole the cows, possibly sold them off. Who knows, but he didn't want to lose his job under any circumstances. So he cast the blame at my door. Simple, really. It's rather like the little eaglets throwing the weaker fledgling out of the nest so that they can gain more for themselves at feeding time from the parents. But didn't you tell Farmer Bryce that you would do no such thing? That you're against stealing of any kind? That this is not the sort of thing that you would ever do? That this is completely out of character? Didn't you try to fight? Didn't you explain?" "Of course I tried to reason with him. He wasn't prepared to listen. It was like talking to a brick wall. He'd made up his mind categorically that I was responsible for the theft. It would seem he can't prove anything without any real evidence, apart from the persuasive words of a farmhand like Kurt, who can be very persuasive if he wants to be. So he decided to sack me." "That's outrageous. He can't do that." "Oh, he can, and he has done it," said my father. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he said, holding my mother in his arms. "I'm sorry to have let you down. I will try my damnedest to look for work in town, but it's not going to be easy." "Well, I'm not going to put up with this," said my mother, stamping her foot belligerently. "This is not acceptable. No way is this acceptable. How can Farmer Bryce do this? How can he sack you with no real evidence? Why would that iniquitous, nasty farmhand lie through his teeth like that? You know what the worst and the most unfair part of all this is? Is any speculative rumours getting out there of your purported thieving of Mr. Bryce's cows. If that gets out, who in their right mind is ever going to hire you for any kind of job? You know what folk are like around here. News travels faster than a wildfire, while rumours get out of control, like an infestation of lice." "Let's not go there, sweetheart. There really is no point in crying over spilt milk. What's done is done. We have to move on with our lives. Try to be positive." True to her word, my mother dressed her nines in her Sunday best the following day, wearing a pretty summer frock and a smart little hat over her blonde, buoyant curls. She looked very fetching. She went to see Farmer Bryce, trying her level best to reassure him that her husband was not responsible for stealing his cows. He refused to listen to any reason. "I'm sorry," he said to her, "but I hardly think my farmhand would lie to me about such a very serious thing. That would be atrociously wicked for him to do. I'm sorry, but the jury's out. Your husband clearly told him he stole my cows." "Even if that were true, and supposing it was," my mother protested indignantly, "don't you see that it makes no sense, Farmer Bryce? Why would a thief confess to his crime? That would be literally begging someone to put a noose over their head. Has it not occurred to you, Farmer Bryce, that your farmhand might be lying to you to cover his own insidious agenda? Maybe he's the one that stole the cows." "Why would Kurt do such a thing, miss?" "The name is Chloe," my mother said, tightening her lip. "You know what, Farmer Bryce? You're a very foolish man. The wool is being pulled over your eyes, and you cannot see it for yourself. Your farmhand is a duplicitous man. You need to watch him carefully, Father Bryce, because I assure you he will do it again. Don't say I didn't warn you." And with that my mother marched off defiantly. In the days that followed, my father was unable to get any work. It was clear that word had spread like wildfire around town that my father was a thief. So people whispered behind our backs in church, gave us furtive, disapproving glances. Even a couple of kids at church pointed an accusatory finger at me, telling me that their daddy said my father was not a good man. The trouble is that mud sticks. It can be very difficult to wash off. Before long, my father just slipped into a huge depression that spiraled out of control. In a trice, he began to get drunk on moonshine. We wouldn't see him all day. At night, he would come back home, and he would be wobbling and staggering all over the place like an inebriated drunk. He had never drunk like this before. My mother would just leave him to sleep off his drunken stupor on the sofa. She'd put a blanket over his body. One night he became a vile, intoxicated drunk. I'd never seen him like this before. He began to belittle, patronize, ridicule my mother, with a kaleidoscope of unkind, cruel, heartless words. My father was a gentleman throughout his life, an honourable man, who took a dim view of anyone who would ever dare raise a finger to a woman. But the very thing that he found so abhorrent, so reprehensible, he began doing to his own mother. As the catastrophic train smash of his life, the helpless despair, the sheer desperation of his plight, the inadequacy he felt not being able to provide for his family, had mushroomed out of control, diminishing his self-esteem, while the toxic effects of the moonshine had transformed him into a belligerent, cantankerous, mean-spirited drunk. I could see my mother's eyes, that had once been so full of adoration for my father, now filled with fear and terror. She was afraid of him. She was unable to cope with his drunken antics, became unduly worried that things were getting seriously out of hand, and of course they were. I do remember the day my father first lashed out at her. He slashed her so hard across the cheek, she nearly fell backwards onto the floor. I could hear her gasp in astonishment as she clutched her burning cheek, that was now purple in colour. He had hit her that hard. "Get out!" she screamed. "Get out of my home! How dare you hit me? How dare you? Leave now! I never want to see you again!" "I'm not leaving, woman. This is my house." "Dad, you heard her. Leave now. You're drunk. You have to leave," I told him. "And don't come back until you're sober," said my mother. My father turned his rage on me. He grabbed me violently, wrestled me, screaming all kinds of obscenities at me. "No son of mine talks to me like this. Do you understand?" I was crying as my father was punching me hard with his fists. My mother hit him on his back with a frying pan so that he turned his attention off from me onto her for a moment. She told me to run. "Run, son! Get out of here! Go!" I didn't need much encouragement. I bolted out of the cabin door, running into the woods, my floundering father swaggering, swaying and tettering behind me in a murderous, incandescent rage. As I entered the wooded area, the place where I hung around so often as a young boy, I felt afraid. I'd always been slightly skittish of the dark. It was scary being in the woods like this. Everything was so different at night, menacing, intimidating. There was a cool breeze blowing that caused the leaves to rustle. It sounded like a woman's long skirts brushing against the ground. I could hear my father running behind me, if you can call it running. I clearly had riled him up, speaking up for my mother. He wanted revenge. He was slurring his words with inaudible protests. "I'm getting you, son. I'm going to get you. I'm going to get you." He was tripping, stumbling and crashing all over the place as he cloddishly weaved himself over viridescent ferns and shrubs in his determined pursuit of me. He was yelling, "I'm going to get you. I'm going to get you." My heart was pounding in my chest violently. My breathing was sharp and fierce. I was looking for somewhere to hide. Tears were pouring down my face, as my shirt was now soaked. I had not even realized that I was crying. It was dark in the woods, but thankfully the canopy allowed a gentle light of the moonlight to filter through the forest, so I wasn't completely stumbling around in the dark. I could hear my father looming ever closer. I didn't know what he was capable of in this drunken state. I couldn't trust him, so I was absolutely frozen with terror. Suddenly I saw something tapping me on the back. It gave me the fright of my life. I nearly jumped out of my skin, but what was it? It was a dark, shadowy, obscure figure, dense in the twilight, tall, big, human-looking. She was indicating for me to follow her. I did. Isn't it ironic, but I felt much safer around this anomalous beast than my own father. She took me towards this rocky outcrop, pulling back this massive rock as though opening a door. The rock would be physically impossible for a normal man to shift. I entered the opening with her. She rolled the rock back, and I discovered we were in a cave, but it was too dark to see a thing. I was to discover the following day that the cave was lined with deer pelts. There were beds made from pieces of broken timber, covered with lots and lots of grass, lined with pelts. The critter placed her hand on my back and led me to the bed. It was surprisingly comfortable. I must have fallen asleep that night, for the next morning I awoke up to find the tall creature studying me curiously. She had been watching me sleep. She seemed conspicuously fascinated by me, but there was also a protective look on her face, along with a kind of warm twinkle in her treacle-coloured eyes. Shafts of sunlight permeated the outer edges of the rock, filtering into the cave, so that I could see her very clearly. I was surprised by her appearance. She looked human, but she wasn't entirely human. How could she be? She was covered in hair. I noticed her hair was a dark brown colour. She smelt of the dust of the earth. I know now, without a doubt, that this lofty, majestic creature was a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot. But back then, I had no clue as to what she could possibly be. I would say she was 7 foot tall, 500 pounds, muscular, burly, powerful, strong, with overlong arms that dangled beyond her knees, a distinctive cone-shaped head, depicting a face so human, a feminine face that had soft angles to it, high cheekbones, a flat nose, deep-set dark eyes that sparkled and glittered with humour. Of course, I knew she was female. She had small breasts, but also possessed such a nurturing, maternal, patriarchal energy. When I awoke, she spoke to me in a strange, audible language that contained lots of clicks. I didn't know what she was saying, but I didn't care. I knew her words were solacing, solicitous, bolstering, comforting. I knew she cared about me. She handed me an apple, so I showed her my favourite trick, where I eat the apple without using my hands, just with my mouth. She copied me, but she could do it so much better than I did. She thought it was fun to eat an apple in such an idiosyncratic way. The creature rolled back the stone from inside the cave, pushing it away from the entrance, guiding me out, replacing the rock back from where it was. It was so seamless that when I observed the rugged outcrop, you could not see that there was an opening in there that led to a cave. You would never have known that in a million trillion years. The creature guided me through the woods, standing in the tree line, watching me return home, and when she felt assured that I was safe, she glided away. My mother was absolutely thrilled to see me. She asked me where I'd been. I remember grinning at her cheekily and saying, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." And I meant every word of it, of course. How would anyone believe such a preposterous, outlandish story? In their shoes, I certainly wouldn't. A day or so later, my father returned home, looking more than a little sheepish, apologising profusely for having treated my mother so badly, and for having chased me in the woods. He did admit he didn't know what he would have done to me. He begged for her to take him back, Of course, my mother's heart melted like butter, as she loved the bones of my dad. Shortly after my encounter in the woods with the strange, hairy humanoid, my family would receive little gifts on our doorstep, like a couple of dead rabbits, a turkey, rainbow trout, a leg of a deer. It was enough to feed a family of 5 and more. So despite our limitations financially, our standard of living rocketed, as we were living off the fat of the land. We began to eat well, based on the strange delivery of gifts at our doorstep, which meant we were eating fish and game very regularly. My mother described it as manna from heaven. She thought an angel was delivering these gifts to us. She was a religious woman. She said we were going through hard times like the Egyptians in the desert before they reached the promised land. You could see she would say, God knows that my husband didn't steal those cows. We are being compensated from the injustice. I never told her that our mysterious angel was in fact a hairy humanoid, as that might have catastrophically destroyed her romantic images of a celestial golden angel with ethereal wings. On reflection, the creature I encountered must have somehow perceived our strained financial hardship. But how she perceived that, I can't fathom. But for some reason she was desirous to offer us her help. Without her generous deliveries, I dread to think how bad things would have become for us. She delivered us from a very challenging time in our lives. Despite my father thankfully abandoning the moonshine to appease my mother, you could see the weight of the world hung upon his shoulders. He was a shadow of the man that he once was, the man that I had known as my loving father. He told me that not being able to provide for your family is the most degrading, ignominious, inglorious and mortifying thing to experience. It had made him feel abjectly worthless. We could see he had sunk into a contemptuous deep depression, as the man with a jovial, fun-loving sense of humour had been vanquished from our home, and instead our cabin was filled with an oppressive gloominess that affected the morale of our home. And even my 2 little sisters, who were always happily playing around in the house with the one-eyed doll they shared together, weren't always comfortable in my father's presence. They would eye him warily, knowing and wondering whether they could trust him. Sometimes he would just sit on the upholstered chair in the cabin, staring out into space. He looked vacant, unengaged, absent, inexpressive, so very lost. My mother went to visit the local pastor to tell him what was going on in our home. She told him my dad couldn't get work. Everyone thought he was a thief. And this had reduced my father into a contemptible, lifeless puddle of water. I gather my mother sobbed and sobbed, while the pastor comforted her assuringly, telling her that everything would be all right. The very next night my father slipped out of our cabin, without anybody even noticing. Shortly afterwards I heard my mother scream, "Ah!" I scrambled out of bed, knowing instinctively that something was terribly wrong. My mother was crying. She was pointing at a note that was perched on the upholstered chair. It read, "I'm sorry, Chloe. I just can't go on. I hope you'll always know how much I loved you and the kids." My mother and I grabbed a kerosene lantern. We dashed out into the night, terrified of what we would find. Luckily, my 2 sisters remained fast asleep in bed. We had to leave them there. We hadn't any choice. Finding my father was a prerequisite. We were certain we would be too late, that we would find him, his lifeless body hanging from a tree in the wood grove, swinging against the breeze like a dress hanging on a clothesline. It was such a dreadful thought. As I ran in the woods, I felt so very numb, as if all physical feeling had been expunged from me. I had a lump in my throat, complemented by a sickly nausea that rose up in the back of my mouth. Truly, I wanted to hurl up the contents of my stomach. I felt violently ill. My mother was as white as a sheet, her eyes wide with terror. She was muttering under her breath, "Please, God, no! Please, God, no! No, God, please! I beg you, God! Please, no!" I just remember the stillness of that velvety black night. Everything was haunting, so deathly quiet. You could have heard a pin drop, as the natural choruses of the night from the insects and the frogs had been extinguished, like the flames from a candle wick. There were no howls from a coyote or wolf, no hoot from an owl. It was ominously still. The only thing I could really hear was the thundering of my own heart, and of course the discernible crushing sound of our boots crackling the twigs and forest debris beneath our cushioned soles. Everything was blanketed in a heaviness that was tangible. The woods were teeming with towering oaks, maples, dogwoods and yellow polars, and they all jiggled ominously against the cool breeze, their boughs swaying backwards and forwards, against the moonlit shadows, making you falsely believe that you were seeing shadow people creeping around you. But I didn't care about any of this. All I wanted was my father back home, safe and well with us. That was the only thing in the world that mattered. The question was it too late? Were we too late? All of a sudden we heard a crashing, crunching sound, as if a tree branch had snapped under a heavy weight. To date, it was the most terrifying sound that I've ever heard. Me and my mother hurriedly dashed towards the sound, terrified about what we would see. We saw a couple of raccoons climbing down a snap bough, who hurriedly scurried away when they saw us. The relief we felt was immeasurable. My mother took her hand in mine, squeezing it tightly. "It's going to be fine. I promise you, it's going to be fine. We'll find him." After searching the woodgrove and finding absolutely nothing, I suddenly remembered the hairy woman in the woods. I wondered if she might have seen anything. "Where are we going?" my mother asked me, perturbed that I was leading her towards a rocky outcrop. Of course, I had no recollection where the cave was, as the rocks all looked uniform and undisturbed, but I knew somewhere in this vast mountainous outcrop was a cave where the hairy lady lived. I started to call out my father's name. Then something extraordinary happened. The rock rolled back, and who should be standing there but the hairy humanoid with my father? She was directing my father out of the cave. My mother was absolutely astonished. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. It looked like she was going to faint from the shock. In her hand, the hairy lady carried a rope with a noose around it. She pointed to my father, his neck, and the noose, looking directly at my mother. My mother said, "I know. He tried to kill himself. Thank you. Thank you for saving him." She ran towards the hairy lady, throwing her arms around her in gratitude. I think the hairy lady was surprised, but she seemed pleased by the kind gesture. She showed my mother that she was keeping the rope. She wasn't giving it to my father. I remember my mother started hitting my dad. "How could you do that to us? How could you do that to us? Why would you do something so silly?" Then she threw her arms around him and burst into tears. "I love you so much, sweetheart. Don't you dare do that to me again. Don't you dare do that to us again. Never ever think that just because you don't have a job that you're not worth anything. You're priceless in my sight." It was on Sunday when we went to church that the pastor began to preach about judgment. "I'd like to quote from Matthew 7, he said. "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the measure you use, it'll be measured to you. Why do you look at the sawdust in your brother's eye, and not pay attention to the plank in your own?" If you think I'm quoting scripture, he continued, I am. But I'm also looking at my congregation, that I'm ashamed to say is full of hypocritical, self-righteous Pharisees, whom all have planks in their eyes, who have been very quick to judge a member of our flock with a cruel, callous heartlessness that makes me ashamed to call myself your pastor. I would have thought better of my own flock, a lot better of all of you. But each and every one of you has disappointed me bitterly. I can only imagine how you have offended, dismayed your heavenly Father in heaven, whom you so proclaim to love. Archibald Blanket, said the pastor, can you please come up here? My father staggered awkwardly to his feet, where he faced the entire congregation, while the pastor put a protective arm on his sleeve. Look at this man here. What do you people all do? When he was sacked from his job, accused of stealing 3 cows from Farmer Bryce, what did you all do? You all went around with fire starters, your poisonous tongues spreading rumours about this man, tearing his reputation to shreds like an old piece of clothing, ensuring that no one would ever offer him a job again. You contaminated and destroyed his reputation. Not only did you destroy his sense of self-esteem, his dignity, his self-respect, but you robbed his family of joy. You were the greatest thieves of all, merciless, repugnant, hideously vile, reprehensible, for you stole from this man his very soul. You robbed from him the joy of his family. You expunged all hope from him, so that he had nothing left to live for. You did that to him, Every one of you here is guilty as charged, without exception. Did one of you offer him a job like the Good Samaritan, who saw the downtrodden stranger on the side of the road in a very bad way, and lifted him out of the pit to help him? Oh, no, that would be too much to ask. For no, my congregation is high and mighty, too high and mighty for all that. The congregation was deadly quiet for a moment. No one said a word. Then one man courageously waved his arm. Pastor, I must apologize. I feel very ashamed. Everyone in this town has been speaking badly of Archibald. We let this happen among us. You're right, Pastor. We should be ashamed of ourselves. Very ashamed. Archibald, he said, addressing my father personally, please will you forgive the townsfolk for the way that we have treated you? My father nodded. Of course, he said. Of course I forgive. For the record, I'd like to stand before God and this entire congregation, swearing to you all that I never stole Farmer Bryce's cows. The man who'd expressed his apologies to my dad said, We all know, regardless of your innocence, Archibald, that we are the ones that have committed the greater crime here, far more insidious than the theft of 3 cows, for we have ruined a man's honour. He lifted his wife's hat off her head, which made her look up in surprise. I think we owe Archibald a very big apology. Anyone like to express their regret with their pockets? Anyone got a good job they can offer Archibald? In the days that followed, our family was treated like celebrities in town. The baker, butcher and grocer gave my family free produce. People sent my sisters brand new toys. The family was given clothes and shoes. Job offers began shooting through the sky like rockets. Better still, Farmer Bryce came to apologise personally to my father, exclaiming that he had to sack Kurt the farmhand, as he was the one that was pilfering the cows. I gather he'd stolen 3 more. Farmer Bryce gave my father 3 cows to compensate for having falsely accused him of taking them in the first place, but the pastor told him to triple it, and so my father ended up acquiring 9 cows and offered him an excellent job as farm manager of Mr. Bryce's farm. Our standard of living escalated so that even the hairy humanoid stopped delivering us gifts. She could sense our lives were a lot better now. Over the years we saw her watching over us as if she considered us her responsibility. She was always taking care of us. I will never forget her. She was such a beautiful soul. I do hear ugly stories told about Bigfoot, but I don't always listen to them. My mother exclaimed that the hairy lady in the woods was very definitely an angel from God, because she had transformed our lives in every way. Without her presence, things would have been very different for all of us. Whoa, I said to Gramps. That's one hell of a story. Did it really happen? Of course it happened, said my Gramps. Well, I'm sorry, Gramps, but your story trumps the Stephen King novel you're reading. It's bloody amazing. I've never heard a story like that. Now you can see why I enjoy having my Gramps around. Over the last couple of years, he has taught me so much. So there you are. That's my story.
My story tonight, the first one, it comes to us from Wayne. He says here, Dear Sarah, my name is Wayne, and I'm involved in wildlife conservation and rescue. It was in the early 80s that I was notified by the authorities about an escaped domesticated tiger that had been seen around the area and was causing all kinds of problems for the locals, who were very frightened about this animal. In my experience, domesticated tigers do tend to gravitate towards human beings because they tend to associate humans with easy food and play, because that's what they've always known. That's why a creature that is normally very elusive in the wild was seen by so many of the locals at the time, and they were terrified of this wild tiger harming or killing any of their children or pets. Farmers were also worried about the fate of their livestock, and so people were extremely concerned about their own personal safety. I was asked to track down this tiger and return it to the owners, because this was beyond being a police matter. The owners were absolutely devastated about their missing Bengal tiger, whom they called Molly, and they adored her. All the family interacted with the creature, and they said that she was very tame, that she would lie on the carpet next to the family when they watched television at night, and would go swimming in the pool with their teenager boy. They regarded the tiger as a member of the family that was really well loved and precious, and assured me that as long as the creature was respected, it would remain docile and affectionate. In my experience, a wild animal cannot be fully domesticated because there's always the potential of that wild, ingrained natural instinct that, if provoked unintentionally, could cause the creature to lash out and cause all kinds of damage. Worse still, if the creature was hungry, he could potentially be very, very dangerous. I cannot tell you where this happened for reasons of confidentiality in this matter. I will tell you that it was an area that was remote and rural, with thousands of square acres of natural forest, which is ideal for a tiger because they need lots of space. Ironically, these vast areas of North American wilderness were perfect for a large cat like a tiger, but not so ideal for someone tracking the creature because it could have been almost anywhere. For me, the first port of call was to go and speak to the people who had had recent sightings of the creature. The one thing I knew was that it would gravitate toward human beings, and this gave me the strong hope that we would be able to recapture the creature quite quickly. I went to visit all the locals in the area who had seen sightings of the tiger, and so I began to get a brief idea of whereabouts the creature might be. I had been tracking animals for years, so I knew exactly what to look out for. One family who contacted me said that they had not physically seen the tiger, but had seen the brush moving in the wooded area of their land, and that they had heard the sounds of huge, massive animals scouting around that had been growling at them and letting out the most aggressive and vicious roars. I decided to search the area, despite the fact that it was much further off the beaten path than the other sightings. Armed with a rifle that I always carried for my own personal protection, I navigated the forest in the way that any tracker would. Your senses have to be sensitive about everything around you so that you can observe everything as carefully as you can. What I saw left me with more questions than answers. Before I go into my story, I just want to stress that I had never ever heard of Bigfoot or Sasquatch before at the time. Remember, it was in the 80s and the hairy man had not had the exposure that he's had now. In those days, most of our information was gleaned from libraries and encyclopedias, so we did not have the knowledge so heartily available today or accessible on our World Wide Web. It was not that I was not open to the idea of such cryptic creatures existing, but it was not something that I'd ever considered or conceived of before. In truth, there are so many areas of North American wilderness that have not been explored by man, so it wouldn't be surprising at all if creatures we do not know about could exist in some of those remote areas. Nothing would surprise me. The first thing I noticed as I started studying the ground, which was fortunately quite muddy from early rainfall during the week, was that there were no tiger trail markers anywhere. I could see signs of turkey, deer, rabbits, and all kinds of other creatures, and I observed all their scat in the area, which also gave me an indication of the kind of animals that had been passing through. But there definitely had been no sighting of a tiger. Suddenly I came across a muddy area that was when I stood still, barely being able to believe what I was seeing. It was a humanoid footprint in the mud that was 16 inches long and 12 feet wide, but it was clearly not from a human or even a bear. I got a good view of the big toe area, and I could see it was too splayed out to be a human's, because humans are a lot straighter because they wear shoes, and whatever this creature was, it had never known a pair of shoes in its life. I could barely believe what I was seeing, but I shrugged it off as my intention was to find the tiger markers that I was not seeing here. I was satisfied that there were no tiger trails in the area and that people had been mistaken about the predator that they thought they had heard, as there was nothing here. Suddenly I noticed everything around me went very quiet and exceedingly still. Birds were no longer chirping, and there were no other sounds. When that happens, I know as a tracker from personal experience, it usually means that a predator is around. I stood very still for a moment in deep contemplation, and then I heard the sound of something very hefty and heavy walking through the brush. But whatever this thing was, I knew it was bipedal. It was walking on 2 legs and definitely not 4. In that moment, I knew something was there. and I've experienced this gut feeling before many times as a tracker, knowing when a dangerous predator is about. It's almost like a sixth sense of just knowing instinctively, and it's inbuilt, and it's for humans to warn them of danger, and it should never be ignored. I could sense that something was watching me, and whatever it was too close for comfort, and not being able to see it was extremely unnerving because it puts you in a position of exceeding vulnerability. Predators use this tool to take advantage of their prey. I could even smell the creature, and the smell was the most unpleasant smell that I have ever smelt in my entire life. In fact, it was so revolting that I went over to the bush to throw up. Was this smell another tool, I wondered, that the creature was using to intimidate its prey, or was it just its natural body odour? As I was speculating about all of this, I suddenly heard the most awful roar, and it was not the sound of a tiger, but something that sounded even more treacherous and deadly. I promise you that my whole body almost shut down. This creature had impacted my natural human reaction by impairing my responses. I just stood there frozen to the spot, barely being able to breathe or move. It was like my legs had grown several tons of weight in a second, and it was difficult to maneuver my body at all. No creature before has ever incapacitated me like this. No lion, no tiger, no bear. And the effects it had on me were so destabilizing. I did not know in the world what to do. But for me, this effect literally bordered on the supernatural. And to this day, I have no rational explanation for my reaction to this creature. No other predator I have ever worked with in my entire life has affected me so profoundly, both emotionally and physically. Then I saw it rushing through the thicket at me with a mock charge. I knew it was a mock charge because I'm experienced at that kind of thing. This is common behavior in the ape species, and it's designed purposely to intimidate. I could see the creature was asserting its authority towards me and making it very clear who was boss. He was behaving this way because this was his territory. I could not believe what I was seeing because I've never seen an animal like this before. You could be forgiving for believing that this was a man dressed in a ghillie suit, but it was way too big to be a human. It was about 7 feet in height and easily 550 pounds. I would say the girth of this chest was 3.5 feet wide. The creature looked as if he did indeed possess both primate and human DNA. It had a very long, elongated skull, like many of the ancient skulls that have been recovered in the past of what some believe belonged to the Nephilim. I would not be surprised if those were the skulls from these Bigfoot creatures. It is a conical head. Its conical head sat on massive shoulders, and it had a long, hairless face with a very distinctive brow ridge and big brown eyes with a very flat nose. It also had very long arms that are a distinctive attribute of the ape species, and I knew this was the creature who had made those large footprints in the mud. There was no doubt about that in my mind whatsoever. As I stood there, I became as submissive as I could. That's what I would do if I was standing in front of a great ape. I did not challenge him, nor did I raise my rifle in his direction. Believe me, this creature was exceedingly intelligent, and he would know what my rifle was. And the last thing I wanted to do was to accelerate his anger and make him even more impulsive and reactive that could potentially be fatal for me. I appealed to the humanness in this creature, which is there, believe it or not, buried beneath all those layers of angry, volatile reactions. And especially in this creature, who was, in no doubt, an alpha male. I diverted my eyes from the creature and played a very submissive role as possible, which is what I would have done if an ape were threatening me. I walked backwards slowly, facing the creature, but looking downwards, and I do believe he calmed down almost immediately. He grunted to himself and chattered away, as if he was finally satisfied that I imposed no threat, and that I wasn't going to be staying for long, and then he just walked away just like that. As you can imagine, I could not believe what I had witnessed, and I do not know what the creature was. I had heard of the abominable snowman before, and that is what I thought this creature must be, until years later I was to discover it was a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch. Some might even call him the abominable snowman anyway. In my profession, there are lots of disbelievers about this creature, so I have not shared my encounter with anyone I know. But when I heard about this anonymous forum, I decided that my secret could come out of its secret box, buried away in the memory files of my mind that have been marked declassified for so long. For many of you animal lovers out there wanting to know what happened to Molly the tiger, well, I'm glad to tell you that we did finally track her down, and I think she was very happy to return to her home, where she was welcomed in with open arms by her loving owners. I would say that as lovely as this domestic tiger is, it still did have the potential to be dangerous. So I hope they survived little Molly, or rather the big tiger. I hope you and your listeners enjoyed my story. The next story is also going to be one that you're really going to love, and so let's get started. Dear Sarah, my name is Angelica and I'm from Oregon. Some may call that the heart of Bigfoot country. I grew up on a 30-acre plot of land and lived in a very basic, rudimentary cabin with my parents and two of my younger siblings. It was in the early 80s when I had my first Bigfoot encounter. My mother was a stay-at-home housewife who manned the fort while my dad was doing jobs for the Forestry Commission. My mother was born to be a housewife because she loved her life raising us, taking care of the livestock and attending to our every need. As far as she was concerned, family was her world, and she went beyond the call of duty to give us the best lives imaginable, and she succeeded wholeheartedly. In those days, we rarely did live off the land like a proper homestead would. My mother grew us vegetables in the garden, and we would get milk and cream from our dairy cows, eggs from our free-range chickens, honey from our bees, and my father was a great hunter, and so we were well fed with fish from our stocked lake, chickens from our farm, and wild animals that my father killed on our land, which ranged from deer, turkey to rabbits. When my dad was away on a job after some early morning homeschooling at school, my sisters and I would spend our days exploring. My mother always kept her steely eyes on our every movement. The land had been in our family since the early 1800s and was very precious to my father and was something he wanted to keep in our bloodline for generations to come. Sadly, that was not going to happen. I knew no other life than getting up in the morning very early to the early sound of the dawn chorus, and to help my mother with all the household chores, which included feeding the chickens, collecting their eggs, or even hand-milking Matilda, who was my personal favourite cow. Later in the day, I'd help my mother bottle preserves, like strawberry jams and pickles, as well as prepare evening meals, which required relentless peeling of potatoes and chopping of vegetables, you know, the usual arduous stuff. One day we had a very unusual visitor come to our home. I do not know what her connection was to our family, but I believe her long since deceased husband had known my dad when he was a boy. This woman was one of the creepiest people I have ever met in my entire life, and if you had told me she was a witch, I would have 1,000% believed you. I think the thing that freaked me out about her the most were her yellow-brown serpent-like eyes that looked through you almost like a vulture scanning its prey from a great height. I could feel those terrible eyes devouring me with every look, and I just wanted to run and hide. "And so who is this?" said the woman, smiling at me with a toothless grin that set my nerves on edge. Why on earth did she have gums with no teeth? I wondered. Why would you go around just with gums and no teeth? It was so odd. "This is my daughter Angelica," said my mother, smiling and pushing me towards the lady as if half expecting me to give her a hug. The lady reached out to grab me with one of her sinewy, arthritic hands, but I pulled away as fast as I could. I did not want this monstrous woman to touch me. "We have got a troubled little soul here," said the lady, looking at me with a distinct look of disapproval. "Poor little mite, she's got a lot of learning to do." My father came into the room full of beams. You remember your step-uncle Niles, who died 5 years ago, he said to me. Well, this is his wife Trudy, and she's going to be joining us for dinner. Isn't that nice? Yes, I said. I was surprised to see that this strange, elderly, grey-haired, blue-rinsed lady, with her black, bedraggled, bohemian-style lacy dress that dangled over her ankles in thin petticoat layers, was having no impact on my younger siblings at all, who seemed oblivious to this woman's blatant peculiarities. The woman reached out for her black wallet-like purse, and I kid you not, pulled out a pair of dentures from a smart silver box and set them back in her mouth before she began to eat. Seeing her do this made my stomach cringe, but my mother pretended not to notice her vulgar behaviour. I mean, surely she could have put her dentures on in the bathroom. All I knew was I wanted to get away from the dinner table as fast as I could. I started playing with my roast turkey and mashed potatoes with my knife and fork like a very bored child. Enough of that, Angelica, my father scolded. Mind your manners, please, and stop playing with your food like that. It's very annoying. Is she always like this, so full of nervous energy? Said the woman. I cannot wait to read her palm. That will tell me a lot about her life purpose. I think you have an interesting one here, she said, speaking with her mouth so full that I could actually see her churning her food like a processor. It was disgusting. I grew cold with disgust. The woman really was a witch, I thought, and I was absolutely terrified of her reading my hand. Supposing she saw me with a crippling, disabling disease, or a terrible sudden accident or disaster in my future. If anything was bad in my future, I would rather not know about it, because knowing for me was far more agonizing than being happily oblivious to what the future had in store for me. I had always been more frightened by what I did not know than by what I could see. My father and mother eagerly presented their palms to the lady. Maybe they did not believe in palm reading anyway, and were just humouring her because she was our guest after all, but they seemed eager to hear what she had to say. The lady looked at my father's hand, and I could see by her dismayed, hesitant expression that something that she was seeing was not at all good. Go on, encouraged my father. Tell me, even if it's not what I want to hear. Am I going to be eaten by a tiger? He teased. The woman was silent, and so quiet that you could have heard a pin drop. What? Said my father. I'm really going to be eaten by a tiger? I would not joke about things like that, said the woman, looking mildly irritated by my father's futile attempts at being humorous. I am not sure you will like what I'm going to tell you, she said. Please, my father urged. I do not know if I believe in this stuff anyway, so just tell me for the hell of it. After all, it's only a bit of fun, isn't it? The woman bit her thin, cracked lips, and then paused for a long moment, and then she spoke. Your life will be cut short by a sudden disaster. I see your head. Yes, something to do with your head. I feel a thumping headache coming on. You mean like a brain aneurysm? Asked my father in horror. No, said the lady, looking at my father with heartless brown eyes. No more violent than that. Like someone causing you grievous bodily harm. Is it someone I know? Asked my dad. And how far in the future do you see this happening to me? And is there any way of stopping it? Your lifeline is cut short here, she said, pointing a crooked finger at my father's hand. Your life will come to a violent, sudden end, and it will be soon. And no, it cannot be changed, because it has already been predestined by the choices you made before your incarnation. In other words, you chose your own ending. I saw the look of total horror on my father's gentle face, and his soft blue eyes seemed to cloud over as if he was pushing back tears. I do not believe in all this reincarnation stuff, said my father. I'm a godly man. Good for you, said the lady, looking at my father with an exasperated expression on her face. I'm only telling you what I see, and I have yet to be proved wrong. You see, the hands do not lie. They're a roadmap of our life paths. My mother's face had grown as white as a sheet, and she hastily grabbed the dinner plates from the table and mumbled under her breath, I'm sure it's not true. I'm sure it's not true. I'm sure it's not true. My mother seemed less eager to present her hand to the lady, and I saw that it had become clammy and sweaty, as if she was terrified about what she might hear, but for the sake of our guest, putting up a brave front and acting like she did not believe it all anyway. It was only a bit of fun after all. "Oh, I see a long life here," said the lady. "I see you chose a very easy incarnation for yourself. You clearly are a very young, inexperienced soul. I do see a few health problems along your journey, something to do with your blood pressure, but on the whole, a good long life. But your ticker will finally get the better of you, but not until you're really old." My mother looked relieved and pushed my hand forward. "Your turn, Angelica. Let's see what the future has in store for you." My heart started to race at 1,000 miles an hour. I was utterly terrified, and the fear I felt caused me to bolt out of the house like an unbridled, rebellious horse, and I literally galloped out of that cabin at 100 miles an hour. I felt as if I was running for my life and being pursued by a malicious predator, and I just continued to run and run and run. I could see that the horrible woman in my mind turning into a hideous demonic creature with long wings, hunting me down like a massive hawk and revealing to me the things I just didn't want to know. Bear in mind that my family lived on a large plot. We're talking about a vast acreage of rambling natural vegetation and ubiquitous trees that had not been tended to for years, as my father's job for the Forestry Commission meant that he had left our hand to its own natural devices. It had become a wilderness that over the years had attracted some of the healthiest looking wildlife that you have ever seen. We had huge deer on our land, and I even saw giant turkeys that they were so big they could have been on the Guinness Book of Records. Some of our property was so remarkably overgrown that the only paths you could see were made by the deer, and these pathways were narrow and relatively low. So I was surprised to find some new pathways that were 8 feet wide and 10 feet high, and they were all over the place. It was almost as if my father had decided to clear away some of the dense thicket that was full of nasty thorns and barbs to clear away for better hunting opportunities. But since when had he had time to do such a thing, I wondered. For a moment, curiosity got the better of me, and I began to forget why I was here in the first place. The sheer terror I had experienced in the presence of that vile woman had finally left me. Even if she had seen a short life from my dad, why had she told him something quite so foreboding and so nonsensical? Why had she been so heartless and so insensitive? The thought of losing my father to a sudden disaster brought tears to my eyes, and I was surprised to find that I really was crying. I could taste the saltiness of my tears. I knew I wasn't supposed to wonder about the wild areas of our land without supervision from an adult, because there are a lot of wild animals here that my father had spotted from time to time, like bobcats, cougars, coyotes, mountain lions, and even a black panther. Yes, I knew I was not 100% safe out here in the wilderness part of our land, but being away from that nasty witch brought a sense of peace and serenity to my being. Come what may, that predator would never get to read my palm, and if it meant spending a week in this rambling undergrowth, well then so be it. It was worth my while. I decided to follow a big path that had been made in the dense undergrowth, and one of them led it to an open clearing with a beautiful stream. It was like I had found a magical secret spot all of my own, a real treasure to be sure, just like the secret garden. I felt this rush of childlike, whimsical delight and pleasure overwhelm my senses. I tore off my shoes and dangled my feet in the water, enjoying the fresh cold wetness on my skin. I surveyed the beauty of my environment and wondered why I had never seen this part of the valley before, when I had been exploring with my dad. I could see the blue-purple silhouettes of the tall mountains standing proudly against the azure blue sky, dotted with white fluffy clouds. There were large regal-looking eagles with massive wingspans soaring majestically across the sky, and I could hear the sounds of pretty bird calls in the valley, and watched in delight as a mother doe with her fawn came to drink at the stream. I saw her watching me, but she didn't seem overly concerned by me, and continued to drink very thirstily. I did not know how long I spent in this open clearing, overlooking the glorious green hilly valleys. I had long since forgotten about my parents, who were probably wondering where I was by now, but I really didn't care. I had found this secret enchanting spot in nature. Besides, it felt great to be away from that witch. I lay back on this warm, sunny rock that was a part of a rocky outcrop that surrounded the beautiful, gushing, pebbling stream with its clear, sparkling water and white, pretty, bubbling foam. I cradled my head in my arms and fell into a deep sleep. As I started to awaken, I could hear this excited chattering sound of two people having a fast conversation in a foreign tongue, and I got the impression that they were talking about me. It sounded like that. I was still in a dreamy state of being half asleep and half awake. I was sure I must be hallucinating or seeing things, because as I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, I saw two little creatures standing before me. When I say little, I don't mean little in terms of the physical sense, but I mean you could sense they were young, they were juveniles, in age, of about 4 foot tall. But I really had never seen anything like them before. I could sense their young, excitable energy. They were studying me with an open fascination, as if I was something so unusual and so out of place. The one creature reached out with a big hairy hand and touched my skin, almost as if he was comparing my skin to his own. His expression was one of enthused awe, as if he was marvelling me like you would a great work of art. And by the way he or she was looking at me, I must have been like a Michelangelo masterpiece to them. They both appeared to find me absolutely fascinating, but the feeling was mutual, because I was equally astonished by what I was seeing. I had never seen creatures like this before, and I did not know that creatures like this even existed in North America. If they did, no one had ever told me about them before. Not my parents, not science books, not anything. I reached out and touched the creature's hairless face, and marvelled at how velvety and smooth the skin was. The creature had warm brown eyes that were friendly and inquisitive, had a prominent forehead, a flat nose, and thin lips. The only thing I can say about the creatures were that they were definitely primates, but they were also very definitely human, and I think it was that humanness that we identified in each other that made us relatable. Even though I did not understand what the creatures were saying, they would mimic their intentions, and their acting was brilliant. I could almost understand them, even though no words were spoken between us. Suddenly both of the creatures looked in the distance, as if they could sense someone was coming, and then they hid me behind a large tree trunk and made gestures for me to stay quiet. I felt as if they were hiding me for someone they knew would not be pleased to see me. Suddenly I noticed everything in the valley went very still and quiet, and then I heard this heavy sound, rather like a really stocky bull walking through the undergrowth. Standing there, I saw this massive creature, which must have been the creature's mother, because she was 8 feet tall, 800 pounds, and had a pair of dangling breasts that had lost their elasticity due to gravity. The creature was covered with brown cinnamon hair, with red tufts growing through. Her hair was smooth and long, and it shone in the midday sun, like a healthy head of hair would. The mother had a very obvious cone-shaped head, which was not as blatantly apparent on her youngsters, and she had virtually no neck, and the hugest shoulders and the smoothest face I've ever seen. Her body was long and lanky, her legs slim and muscular, her arms and chest were enormous, like a first-class athlete that performs in major marathons. The creature was agile, strong, and incredibly muscular. I was glad to be hiding from her, because her sheer size intimidated me, and a one-on-one encounter would have been very frightening for me. She continued to chatter with her kids for quite a time, and in my opinion they were speaking a very clear primate language. Suddenly I could hear the sound of human voices in the valley. "She could be around here," I heard one man say. I could hear my mother crying out in dismay, "Angelica, Angelica, Angelica, where are you?" I realised that my mother had called out a search party with all the locals, and they were looking for me. I have never seen creatures react as fast to human voices as these creatures did. I watched the juveniles jump onto their mother's back with the agility of a monkey, and they scurried up the foliage of a large tree where they seemed to squirrel themselves to the top of the large canopy and almost become one with the green leaves at the very top of the tree. I do not believe you would have spotted them in plain sight. That was how invisible they became. The mother herself seemed to blend into the scenery, and even though I knew she was hiding, I actually could not see her. It was like she had vanished and disappeared. Suddenly I saw my mother, and she looked so frantic and hot and bothered that I ran out of my hiding space to comfort her. "Oh, Angelica," my mother cried, "why did you run off like that? We've been so awfully worried about you. Something quite dreadful could have happened to you. Have I not warned you about cougars and mountain lions before?" My mother was more happy to see me than she was angry with me. I told her that that witch-like woman had scared me half to death, and she did seem to understand. "We had to be nice to her," said my mother. "She was our guest, you see." "But what about all the horrible stuff she said about Daddy? It was so cruel, it was so unkind." "I don't think she intended to be mean, darling. It's just what she claims to have seen in your dad's hands, that's all." "But it's not true, Mummy, is it?" I asked. "I don't want Daddy to die like that," I said. "Of course it's not true," said my mother, taking me into her arms and cradling me. "Is that why you ran away? You didn't want her to look at your hand?" I nodded. "I don't want her saying horrible stuff to me like she did to Daddy." "Of course not," said my mother. "But she's gone now. Do you know what she called you? She said you had an eagle spirit." "What's that?" I asked. "The soul of a truth seeker, someone who wants to find answers to life's many mysteries. Well, that's what she said to us anyway." It was not long after meeting that witch-like woman that her prediction came true about my father. He was in a restaurant one day with some members of the Forestry Commission, including their wives, so my mother was there too. There was a shootout at the restaurant involving the four robbers. One woman in the restaurant fainted in terror when the robbers demanded that everybody in the restaurant open their wallets and hand over their jewelry. My father rushed to this lady's aid, and one of the ladies shot both my dad and the lady at point-blank range, and they were killed instantly. After my father's untimely demise, my mother sold our land against the wishes of my father. I think he would have understood, though, why she needed to let go of the place that held so many beautiful memories for her, which were haunting reminders of her dreadful loss. We finally sold up and moved to Boston, where my mother became a head baker for a local cake shop. My mother never married again, but she did develop high blood pressure, but is still going strong at 80 years old. All these years later, I think about my encounters with the two young creatures, which I now know to be Bigfoot or Sasquatch. It was only by chance I discovered a program that talked about these creatures as being elusive and impossible to find. I do believe that to be true, because they do know how to blend in with their environment, and I think they do that for survival. I would not mind betting that people have directly looked at a Sasquatch in plain sight and never seen it, even if it was yards away or in touching distance. Nothing would surprise me about those creatures.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my heart was heavy, weighted down by the oppression of my regret, and of all the missed opportunities in my life that I'd thrown to the wayside and dismissed due to the bull-headed way I sometimes handled things. I sat by the crackling fire, watching the golden flames dance around the timber in the hearth, as it spitted, popped, hissed and sizzled. There was something rather reassuring about a cosy warm fire on a cold winter's night, but even the fire didn't warm the coldness in my heart. I sat back on my leather recliner, lifting up the leg area, flickering the control on my television, but every station did not resonate with me. It was absolute drivel, from boring sports commentators to television presenters putting on those dreadful, cheerful laughs. When you're feeling as flat as a pancake and as grumpy as a belligerent badger, those fake laughs can be so nauseating. I sighed and poured myself a Manhattan, taking a huge swig of the pungent cocktail to console myself. As soon as the alcoholic beverage hit the back of my throat, burning it slightly, I felt relief, so I poured myself another. That was so much better. I glanced around my Seattle apartment with a cursory look. It really was a man cave that could certainly do with a feminine touch. It was begging for a touch of the savoir faire to soften the rough edges of my apartment. A vase of flowers, some attractive curtains, some interesting artwork would not go amiss in this apartment of mine. that was begging for a woman's finer touch. Indeed, many of my former female guests had remarked on how stark my home actually was. My living room boasted a large bookshelf that extended across the entire right-hand side of the wall, bursting to the seams with detective novels. There was a chunky brown leather settee with a furniture that was designed for comfort rather than elegance. A large ornate walnut coffee table. On its surface was a bowl of fresh green apples, along with the in-house telephone, a notepad and pencil. There was a large fluffy cream rug that graced the oak wooden floors, and of course central stage was the stunning fireplace with the oak mantel, balancing a few of my knickknacks. The walls of my home were undressed, apart from a picture I'd bought at the flea market of President Abraham Lincoln, who was positioned over the mantel in my living room. Sometimes I had drunk a little too much. It would seem that the eyes on the portrait would almost come alive. It was at times like these that I would toast Mr. Abraham Lincoln himself, as I was doing so now with my Manhattan. "Good evening to you, good sir," I said, swinging my glass towards the picture. "May God bless America." Interrupting the precious silence was the nagging sound of the telephone. I lifted the receiver. "Hello, darling," came my mother's voice. "Hi, Mum," I groaned. "Sweetheart, I'm worried sick about you. You haven't been yourself recently. Last time I saw you, I noticed your pants were getting rather loose. I'm worried you're losing weight and that you're not eating. It's because of Melanie, isn't it?" "Mum, please, let's not go there. My personal life really is not your business." "Oh, but it is my business. Everything that concerns you is my business. I'm your mother, after all. If my son is distressed about something, I'd very much like to help. What on earth happened? I thought you and Melanie were so perfect together. What went wrong between the two of you?" "I'd rather not go there, Mum, if you don't mind." "Sometimes, sweetheart, it helps to talk about these things. I can see this breakup has hit you very hard." "I don't want to talk about it, Mum. Please, will you go now?" "Look, I don't want to be a nag, but you're keeping yourself warm, aren't you? It's freezing out there. There's quite a wind tonight. I worry that you're not eating enough." "Mum, I'm very warm. I'm sitting by a crackling fire, and I've eaten enough." "Good, sweetheart. I do worry about you. I'm your mother. It's my privilege." "Bye, Mum. Nice talking to you." I sighed as I put the telephone down. Why did my mother have to bring up Melanie's name again? It had been 3 months since I'd broken up with her. I was cursing myself for such an impulsive, off-the-cuff decision. It made me physically sick to think about what had happened between the two of us. Reliving that night over again was not what I wanted to do. The moment I met Melanie, I realised that she was different to anybody else I'd ever known. I had blown it with her, like I did with every other relationship I ever had. Why was I such a disaster at dating women? Other men seemed to land with their bums in a field of clover, but not me. Over and over again I kept making the same mistakes with women. My problem was jealousy. I hated to admit it, but the green-eyed monster had reared its ugly head in many of my relationships. When I got jealous, I literally blew smoke out of my nostrils, acted irrationally, impulsively, until I not only rocked the boat, but I capsized the bloody thing in the process. What can I do? Like most men, I had to live with my mistakes, and that was not easy. I had met Melanie when I was flying back from Vegas to Washington. She had ended up sitting next to me on the plane. A fine dusting of serendipity touched my life that day, like the sprinkles of icing snow on a mince pie. I remember she was reading exactly the same Agatha Christie novel as I was. We were astounded that two people on exactly the same plane should be reading the same novel at exactly the same time, only pages apart. I was on page 102, she was on page 103. I mean, what were the chances of that? As you can imagine, that was really an icebreaker. We both talked the whole way back to Washington, about the books we appreciated reading, the wonderful countries we'd visited, the things that we enjoyed doing. I'd realised we had so much in common. I knew I wanted to see her again. She was easy on the eye, with long dark brown hair, highlighted with blonde streaks, sparkling hazel eyes, with 2 cheeky dimples on either side of her cheek that made her look younger than her years, as similarly we were both in our early 30s. "We must do this again," I said, taking down her number, tucking it in my wallet. But for some reason I lost it. I had stupidly written it on a $10 note with a red marker. I imagine I must have paid someone with that $10 note. It wasn't the cleverest or brightest idea of mine. I had no idea where she worked, what she did for a living, or even what her surname was. So I resigned myself to the fact that I had let a good thing slip through my fingers like butter. I was so disappointed with myself, as anyone I dated after meeting her was just so dull by comparison. Melanie had struck me as having such a great sense of humour, had been easy to talk to, so our conversation had flowed without any awkward silences. About 5 months later, when my nephew had to go into accident and emergency after making a petrol bomb, would you believe it, with his best friend Thomas in my backyard, it exploded, causing him to acquire some 3rd-degree burnings on his lower arm. My yard shed had completely been obliterated as shards of timber were scattered all over the lawn like pieces of shrapnel from a war scene, while neighbours came dashing out of their houses frantically to find the source of the ear-piercing explosion that was far too close for comfort. "Oh my God!" people were screaming. "What happened?" They were to see one child writhing in agony, one decimated yard shed, and one young boy looking sheepish, trying to explain to the wary neighbours why he'd made a petrol bomb in the first place, his childish reasoning not impressing the neighbours at all. "It was only a bit of fun." While one of the neighbours had called the emergency services and ambulances had arrived on the scene to escort my nephew to hospital, his friend was being given the 3rd degree. "What do you think you're doing, young man? Do you realise you could have been killed or harmed an innocent bystander? What possessed you to do such an incredulous thing?" "It wasn't supposed to go off like that," he had explained. "It was supposed to go off like a firecracker. I told you, it was only a bit of fun. We got the instructions off YouTube." When I arrived at the hospital with my nephew, who should be the doctor on duty dealing with his burns, but Melanie herself, serendipity had powdered my life again. I watched in awe as she attended to my nephew's wounds. I was the one who brought him into the hospital, as I regret to say it was my backyard where the kids had made that petrol bomb, something my sister was not best pleased about. "Really, Robin," she had chided, "you know what young boys can be like. My son is always getting up to mischief. You should have kept a better eye on him. He could have been killed. They both could have been killed." I knew she was absolutely right about that. I had failed abysmally in my duty in taking better care of them. Even my neighbours said as much. It was weighing heavily on my conscience when I brought my nephew into accident and emergency. He was in a great deal of pain, but luckily the wound looked worse than it actually was. I'm only grateful that his friend was unscathed, and that the burns on my nephew were just relegated to his lower arm. When Melanie approached me, I was too distracted to really notice her. "The good news, Mr. Boxwell," she informed me, "is your son is going to be absolutely fine. He'll make a full recovery. Unfortunately, he will sustain some permanent scarring on his lower arm. But then he can carry them proudly as battle wounds, and I'm sure he'll be quite proud of them." "He's my nephew. So you're sure he's going to be all right?" "Absolutely." She then looked at me curiously. "You look familiar. Do I know you? Have we not met somewhere before?" That was when we both realised that we had met on the aeroplane from Vegas to Washington. It was Melanie. I explained I'd lost her phone number. I had intended to get in touch. "If you want to drink sometime with me, you'll find me after work on a Wednesday night, having drinks at the bar on 3rd Street, she told me. And so it was, after we started meeting up regularly, that the romance blossomed between us. I was absolutely certain that she was the one for me. After dating for over a year, it was one evening when I was invited to a party with her where the vast majority of people in attendance at this cocktail function were actually involved in medicine. She left my side almost the entire evening, spent the entire time talking to another doctor, in such engaged, animated, enthused conversation. She looked so excited, so enthralled. I became incensed, being ignored like this while my girlfriend appeared to be flirting effusively with this man. Well, that was my interpretation of the event, watching her from a distance, that was. The pool party was around a large sweeping swimming pool, where no one was swimming, but there were lots of drinks flowing. Exotic, colourful cocktails with cherries and pineapples and little umbrellas garnishing the drinks, and exotic trays full of delicious snacks, along with gatherings of people who all knew each other very well. They drank champagne together, talking about medicine, so I truly felt like a fish out of water, as I hovered over the buffet table to get personally better acquainted with a platter of salmon bellinis and caviar that appeared to be beckoning me, calling my name. A young man approached the table, grinning at me brightly. "I saw you earlier on in the evening with Melanie," he said. "Abandoned you, has she?" "Something like that," I said. "You're not in medicine, are you?" "No," I said. "I'm an engineer." "Thought so." "There you go," he teased. "The problem with being in medicine is sometimes all we ever talk about is medicine, even after we come home after a hard day's work. I can see Melanie is caught up in conversation over there with Dr. Radcliffe. Fascinating man he is. But she'll be back soon, don't you worry." He was wrong about that, for Melanie did offer me some apologetic glances from a distance, even mouthing a few "I'm sorries," but she basically abandoned me all night. I was livid. My evening was spent parked around the buffet table like a spare part, having scant, meaningless conversations with people who were helping themselves to snacks, about the quality of the olives and where to source the best smoked salmon. At the end of the evening, as Melanie climbed into the trap with me, so that I could drop her off at her apartment, I piped, "I hope you're happy with yourself. Had a nice evening, did you? I'm glad someone did. I was bored as hell with only the olives and salmon bellinis for company. I barely saw you all evening. Thanks for ignoring me and abandoning me like that." "Oh, it was a brilliant evening," she said, her eyes twinkling, ignoring my sarcastic comments. "Do you know who that doctor was? Do you realise who I was speaking to?" "No, I don't. Neither do I want to. I could see you were getting very cosy with him." "It wasn't like that, Robin. This was the first chance I got to speak to Dr. Radcliffe about some of the pioneering treatments they've recently developed for burn victims. It's exciting, revolutionary stuff." "So you abandoned me all evening to talk about burns with this Dr. Radcliffe, did you? Do you realise I felt like a prize idiot standing there all on my own, looking so gormless, while my girlfriend is outrageously flirting with the man? How do you think that made me feel?" "I'm sorry. I got carried away. I'm passionate about medicine, passionate about burns. I wasn't flirting. I was excited about what he was telling me, about some groundbreaking breakthroughs, that's all. It was perfectly innocent." "You mean you're passionate about Mr. Radcliffe? I could see the way that you were ogling him." "You've got it all wrong, Robin. It wasn't like that. You're making me cross now. I'm sorry I abandoned you. It wasn't intentional. This was the only opportunity I had to meet Mr. Radcliffe myself. He's not the kind of person who socialises much. To be able to talk to him like this was such a fabulous opportunity. It was wonderful to be able to talk to him about cutting-edge treatments. They were so brilliant. I learnt so much this evening. The future in burn medicine is looking very promising." I gritted my teeth angrily, and then I said something that I couldn't unsay. "It's over, Melanie. We're over. I don't think we should see each other again." I spouted this angrily, my words spitting out like fire from a dragon's mouth. Melanie sat there staring out of the windscreen, not saying a single word. I could see there were tears brimming in her eyes. "Fine, if that's what you want. If you must know, I think you've been very unreasonable, very pig-headed." For the rest of the journey she kept her eyes pinned on the road. Then I dropped her off at her apartment. She climbed out of the car, slammed the door behind her, walked away, not saying a single word, but I did know she was crying. Regretfully, those were the last words I'd spoken to her. My pride had stopped me from calling her back. 3 months had gone by, and there were so many times I was eager to phone her, but I just couldn't. I knew I was the one that had overreacted, seen things that weren't actually there. My girlfriend was just guilty of meeting an illustrious, distinguished doctor with a remarkable reputation in the field of burns, who was able to tell her all about the innovative spearheading breakthroughs in burn treatments. She was just so fascinated about the subject that she had forgotten about the time, also about me. I suppose in the circumstances it was perfectly understandable, but for some reason I had said things I didn't mean to say, ended a relationship that meant the world to me. I knew I was a complete and utter and total fool. As I sat there pondering over this, so many regrets surfaced in my mind. I wanted to see my girlfriend again, but I didn't know how to go about breaking the ice or apologising to her. For all I know, she could be dating that Dr. Radcliffe fellow by now. The thought made my belly burn with indignation. The fire was now dying in the crate. It was cold out there with icy blizzard winds blowing. I could hear the winds howling outside, beating against the windows of my home, causing the boughs of the trees to sway vigorously. I just knew that I wanted to see Melanie. I didn't want to phone her. I wanted to see her right now, to apologise for overreacting. My mother's phone call seemed to have jolted me out of my slumber, brought me to my senses. I knew I didn't want to give up on Melanie, nor on us. So despite the crazy weather, I decided to take that drive in my car. It was a Friday night. I knew that on every second weekend Melanie was off. She loved to spend it at her parents' quaint wooden cabin in the countryside, an hour outside Seattle, where we'd spent many a happy weekend together. I'd go there right now, I thought. I was certain I remembered the way. Well, at least I hoped I did. A lingering dread hovered over the back of my mind, that she could be entertaining a new man in her life. Jealous twinges stung me like hundreds of jellyfish, as I remembered the way that my girlfriend had hung on to the acclaimed Mr. Radcliffe's words at that party, as if they were gold dust. Imagine if the two of them were together. I could hardly bear the thought. I knew I was crazy. I was mad, but my relationship with Melanie was worth fighting for, every inch of it. I just hoped that she would feel exactly the same. If she didn't, well, there wasn't much I could do about it, but I knew I'd never forgive myself if I didn't at least try. I threw on my anorak. The southwesterly wind was blowing fiercely, but I made the hasty dash back to my truck, climbing inside. There was a biting chill in the air. My cheeks burned as gusts of icy cold air thrashed them like cold slapping hands. It was a dark velvety night, with clusters of silvery stars twinkling from the earth's vast canopy, while a bright full moon caressed the sky with an effusive light, rendering the sky a light grey colour, which meant the visibility wasn't too bad. I sighed with relief. I knew driving in the dark could be exceedingly intimidating. I could hear the cheerful, reassuring chorus of the crickets and frogs as I left my green leafy neighbourhood, driving down Seattle's prominent asphalt roads. Much later on in the journey, I took a swift left-hand turn and veered off onto a remote dusty road well off the beaten track. I put on the radio, listened to the news and tuned in to Cairo News and Talk. I could see the wind was blowing fiercely. The occasional small piece of tree fall, usually an unstable branch cropped with clusters of leaves, had snapped off, was lying precariously in bedraggled heaps on the side of the road. There were many of them like that. This was some wind that was not for the faint-hearted. I was getting close to Melanie's parents' cabin when the red dirt road that I was supposed to turn down was blocked by a large tree that had seemingly fallen into the middle of the road, completely blocking my path. Oh, damn, I thought, just my luck. A log in the middle of the road barricading the way. This was all I needed. I climbed out of my truck, pondering whether I should move this thing or not. It was a sizable tree. I wasn't actually sure if I could shift it out of the way. As I approached the fallen tree to examine it better, something slipped out of the dark shadows. It was a figure moving towards me so graciously. It looked like it was floating. I froze to the spot, for the silhouette was easily over 8 foot tall. To my amazement, it ran up to me, waving its overlong arms at me frantically to get my attention. In the shafts of soft moonlight that dappled the contours of her body in an ethereal light, I could see her features. Her human-like face wore an expression of dread. The brown, deep-set eyes were troubled. For a second her eyes locked into mine. She held my gaze for a moment. It was almost as if she was scanning my thoughts, reading my heart, deciding whether she could trust me or not. That was when in my head I could hear an audible female voice pleading with me. Please help, my baby, My baby. I realised at once that this creature was a Bigfoot. She towered above me like a very substantial tall tree, solidly built like an army tank, with a pyramid-shaped head, covered in long flowing dark hair, with overlong arms. The creature suddenly thrust a 3-foot creature towards me, that I realised was her youngling. She was pointing to its chest, making a howling sound. To my horror I saw that its chest had been impaled with a tree branch, as the long thin sapling had plundered its chest to the other side, so that the tree branch had seared him like a skewer. It was the kind of injury that could affect the heart or cause a lung to collapse, both potentially fatal injuries. It was quite literally the most horrific thing I'd ever seen. The youngling looked terribly afraid, his mother even more so. It was amazing that the mother was so intelligent. She knew better than to remove the tree branch from her youngling's chest, seemed fully aware of the implications of such an injury. I was amazed that she was reaching out to me for help. She was so desperate. I knew this little whimpering creature did need my help. Not for a moment did I consider my own fear. I bustled the creature quickly into the front of my truck. Luckily, at 3 foot tall, it was really rather small, while the branch jutting through him was about 2 feet long. I made sure the creature was sitting in the perfect position in the front seat, so that no pressure was exerted on the branch to potentially cause more damage. I looked up at the mother, and I said to her, "I'll see what I can do." I could see a hope rising up in her brown eyes as she let me take her youngling under my charge. I needed help as soon as possible, and who better than Melanie to help me in this bizarre situation? I could hardly call an ambulance for a creature that was not exactly human, but then again, it really was. The large creature moved the fallen tree from across the road to one side so that I could get by. I realised she must have strategically placed it there to get help for her youngling, by reaching out to a human of all things. Melanie's cabin was not far from here. I could only hope that she would be there now, more than ever. I found the familiar sign in the road which read the Lazy Bear Lodge. I was now on the right path. It was a disagreeable drive, my truck jolting, wobbling, shuddering down the precipitous rocky driveway that led directly to the cabin. An uncomfortable trip, causing the little critter to let out agonised cries, as the poor thing winced, recoiled, and flinched in pain with every single bump. Finally, I was parked outside Melanie's cabin, but to my horror there were 2 other cars parked there as well, that I didn't recognise at all. The cabin looked more like a large chalet with a lovely wraparound porch. I didn't waste any time. I ran up to the front door. I know it was late at night. The wind was howling, beating and whipping my clothes. I began banging at the door as hard as I could. "Melanie! Melanie!" Melanie came to the front door, wearing a pink dressing gown, her hair all tousled, her eyes very sleepy. She opened the door. "What are you doing here?" she gasped. "I need your help urgently, Melanie. I've got a patient in the front of my truck. He's been impaled." "Well, haven't you called the emergency services yet?" she asked, looking shocked. "Why on earth did you bring him back to my cabin? He needs specialist care right now. An impalement is a serious injury." "That's not possible, Melanie. The patient's not entirely human. Can you not help him?" "Not entirely human?" asked Melanie, looking nonplussed. "What are you talking about?" "It's a little Bigfoot," I explained. "Its mother entrusted me with her youngling. She wants us to help him. She's desperate." "What's going on?" asked 2 female figures emerging through the doorway, with worried expressions on their faces. Both women were also wrapped in dressing gowns. Their hair looked tousled like Melanie's. It was clear that all 3 doctors were spending a girls' weekend together at her cabin. I couldn't have been in better hands with this little Bigfoot. Melanie turned around to her friends. "We're going to have to help a little Bigfoot. It's been impaled. Naturally, we can't take it to hospital because it's not human. We have to work on it here, hope for the best. Are you up for it, guys?" "Is this some kind of a wind-up?" "A Bigfoot? No, you're joking. Are you really being serious?" came the stunned response. "I mean, are those things even actually real?" "Wait and see," I said. "I'll be bringing him in now." The wind whipped against us as me and Melanie ran as quickly as we could to my truck, helping to guide the little Bigfoot out of the door. The poor thing was whimpering. He seemed overwhelmed with so many human eyes fixated on him, staring at him in wondrous awe. as seeing a Bigfoot certainly astounded the doctors, as it had done for me. But then their attention was rightly turned towards helping the idiosyncratic creature. He was a lanky little thing, with thin legs, overlong arms, and a stocky torso for one so young. "It's going to be all right," said Melanie, grabbing the Bigfoot's hand kindly, and bringing him into the cabin. The creature looked at her with its bright, frightened dark eyes. "We're going to do our best to help you, I promise," she said to him. "Is he going to be all right, Melanie? Is he going to die?" "It depends on a lot of things," Melanie told me. "It depends whether the sapling has caused any internal damage. The creature's fortunately got a large chest. We can only hope that the impalement has not caused internal bleeding, rupturing or puncturing. We're just going to have to pray that everything goes well. Keep your fingers crossed. We haven't got the technology here that we have at the hospital for scans and stuff like that. I can't promise you that the youngling is going to survive, but we'll do our level best to make sure that he does. That's all we can hope for in the circumstances." They took the little creature into a little room where Melanie had some medical supplies, and as luck would have it, an oxygen tank. I sat back awkwardly on the comfortable upholstered chair in the living room, clenching my fists anxiously, knowing full well that things could go terribly pear-shaped. I was solicitous and disquieted about the poor Bigfoot mother, who'd reached out to me for help. How would she react if I returned her youngling back to her dead? Even more extraordinary, how did that poor thing manage to get impaled by a branch? It was all exceedingly bizarre. I began to pace around the cabin anxiously, while the wind continued to howl outside the windows, and the Douglas fir trees in the woodgrove that surrounded the cabin were almost dancing in the wind. I could hear the youngling's painful cries coming from the room. I tried to block my ears. The sound was very disturbing. "Please, God," I prayed, don't let this poor thing die." As my anxiety escalated, I could feel a cold chill running down my spine, so I busied myself restocking the timbers of the fire in the crate. Some of the timber was still smouldering from the evening's fire, so I added some timber along with some steel wool. A perfect fire starter. In a trice the fire was burning brightly in the crate. I glanced around the living area, and there were dirty wine glasses smeared with lipstick marks on the rims. They were on the coffee table, along with a massive pizza box and dirty plates. I decided to distract myself, so I took the dirty plates and glasses to the sink and began to wash up the dishes. It felt good to keep myself busy and occupied. I glanced out of the kitchen window of the cabin. I could see the tall silhouette of the mother Bigfoot pacing up and down as she moved between the tall Douglas firs and the woodgrove. I was stunned. She'd followed us all the way to the cabin. She looked like any other mother in a hospital waiting room, frantically worried about their child. I was struck by how human she appeared, despite the fact that she was so enormous from every perspective. Melanie finally entered the kitchen. In her hand she held the sapling branch that had pierced the Bigfoot. I took it into my hands, marvelling that this thing had gone right through the torso of a little youngling. It was badly smeared with blood. "I'm sorry," she said. "We did everything we could." Her face looked stern and very sober. I dropped the sapling branch on the ground, where it fell on the wooden floor with a crash. I wrapped my arms over my head and began to cry out in despair. "Please, God, it's not dead. Please don't tell me it's dead." "Don't be silly, I'm only kidding," teased Melanie. "It went seamlessly. The news is good. There wasn't much bleeding at all. The sapling branch didn't touch any vital organs or even touch the lungs, so he's a very lucky Bigfoot indeed. We've stitched him up very nicely and he's good to go, but he'll be a bit tender in that spot for a while, but no harm's been done, so it was an excellent job all in all." All three doctors entered the room smiling brightly, with very happy-looking expressions on their faces, with the little Bigfoot walking beside them. His eyes were so filled with joy. He darted towards the sapling on the floor and began chattering excitedly to us in a strange language as he examined it. "That's right," said Melanie. "That was in you. Can you believe it? But we got it out." The creature began to bounce up and down like an excitable dog. "I think we should give him something to eat," said Melanie. "The poor creature's had a nasty shock." She rifled through her fridge, bringing out a large slice of apple pie for the creature. When presented with the apple pie, the creature lifted it up to his flat nose and sniffed it. Then he took a bite, loved the taste. He virtually poured the contents of the entire plate down his mouth, chewing it happily and presenting his plate back to Melanie for another slice. She couldn't refuse him. I think he ended up eating the entire pie, but nobody was saying a word. "I'll be back in a moment," I said. "I need to get the mother. I saw her in the wood grove anxiously pacing up and down between the Douglas fir trees. I think she's desperate to get news of her youngling. It took her an enormous amount of courage to reach out to me to get help. She even blocked the road with a timber beam so that I was forced to get out of my truck, which was when she approached me." "Wow, I'm impressed. That is incredible," said Melanie. "What a resourceful mother, who would stop at nothing to help her child, even if it meant reaching out to a human. She was clever not to remove the sapling pole from her youngling's torso. You go and get her, Robin." I opened the cabin door to be hit by the whipping currents of ice-cold air, and of course the howling wind. It was freezing out there. The wind had gained strength, so I felt as if my whole body was being pummelled against a powerful force, but I didn't even care. Out of the trees a shadowy figure moved towards me so gracefully. Once again she looked like she was floating. It was the Bigfoot female. I could see that her deep-set dark eyes were full of anxiety, but one look at me and she seemed to sense that the news was good, as a light came on in her eyes. It would seem her deflated, sagging body rejuvenated like a flower in the meadow after the spring rain has fallen, as it straightened, which made her body appear even taller. "It all went well," I said, hoping that she could understand my words. "We couldn't have asked for a better outcome." I felt like a doctor talking to a patient's parent after an intense surgery and giving her the good news. She clearly did comprehend what I was saying, as she let out a couple of delighted whoops and began jumping up and down on her legs for joy. She followed me to the cabin. The door was flung open by Melanie. It blew back violently against the log pole beams of the cabin. The little Bigfoot came tearing out of the cabin as fast as he could. He was faster than the wind, dashing towards his mother with the sapling piece in his hands, which he couldn't wait to show her. She threw him up in the air in delight, catching him in her arms. The youngling showed her the sapling piece that had gone through him. The mother examined it with an expression of absolute wonderment on her face. She rubbed her fingers across the wound. She looked impressed to see that the hole in her son's torso had finally been sewn up. The Bigfoot female looked at us. Her eyes were full of gratitude. She nodded to us, turned around and glided away, disappearing into the trees, while the wind kept howling. "Get back inside," said Melanie, pushing me back into the cabin, "before you catch your death of cold. That wind is not about to let up any time soon." "This is Robin," she told her two friends. "Robin, this is Alice and Jennifer." "Good to meet you," I said. "Thank you for helping me out tonight." Alice grinned. I knew it was going to be exciting coming out to the cabin for the weekend with Melanie, but I never expected to be operating on a Bigfoot. This has been one of the most exciting nights of my life that I shan't forget in a hurry. I'm glad we could help the poor little fellow. But even at such a young age, he had such a robust body. If he had been fully human, he might never have survived that impalement, never. But he was built of tough stuff, that little thing. "Melanie, can I have a word?" "Of course," she said. "I miss you," I told her. "I miss us. I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry for overreacting at that party." "No, I'm sorry. You were right. I shouldn't have abandoned you in the way that I did at the party. It was so inconsiderate of me, selfish even. I'm the one that should be sorry. I also miss you." To cut a long story short, I'm glad to inform you that me and Melanie rekindled the flame of our relationship. We are now happily married, have been so for 20 long years. Now I know better than to get jealous when doctors get caught up in discussing medicine. We all decided to keep what happened between us with that Bigfoot youngling. We kept it a secret. We are desirous for those beautiful creatures to live together in peace without being bothered by humans. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I was about 23 years old at the time and was on a fabulous beach holiday in Southern California with my two best friends, Laura Matrose and Linda Schmidt. We were lying out on our colourful swimming towels, our heads covered in floppy sun hats, our eyes sheltered behind dark sunglasses, while reading our novels, basking in the gloriously warm sunshine, while we twiddled our feet in the soft exfoliating sand of Venice Beach, enjoying the pleasure of the soft granules sloughing our feet. We watched the undulating thunderous breakers crashing to the shore, moving across the sand in soft waves that filled in the footprints where people had once walked with water just moments before, transforming them into faint holes. We marvelled at the sound of the surf crashing as it rolled towards the shore with a plethora of foaming bubbles, along with delighting in the salty smell in the air that you could even taste on your tongue, which was always nostalgic, reminding me that yes, I was on holiday, that this was my opportunity to let my hair down, to run bare feet in the soft sand with the wind blowing against my cheeks, to forget all about my job back home in Charleston. I smiled as people in the water shrieked with delight as they skipped over the waves, some daring to go deeper, to tackle the kind of waves that could duck you under, steal your breath away. It was a gloriously beautiful day. We were soaking up the sun like ravenous sponges, having lathered ourselves down heavily with sunscreen, while we watched some surfers skidding above the waves as they squatted down on their boards, in their wetsuits. They seemed to ride the waves with such an expert grace that was seamless and impressive. I didn't for a moment wish to trade places with any of them. I loved the safety of taking things easily. Risks were to be taken by people braver than myself. "Let's go into the water," I said to Laura. "I'm getting overheated." "Good idea," she said. We both ran into the water, feeling the cool surf washing against our bodies. We were both feeling exhilarated, as our wet hair dangled around our faces in rats' tails. Our eyes were red from the sea salt. Our bodies glistened with the ocean's spray. I could feel someone poking me in the back. It was a woman wearing a bright yellow bathing costume standing behind me. I turned around to see a woman in her early 30s. Her dark brown hair was swept back in a neat ponytail, while her olive skin was covered with a generous amount of sunscreen. Her dark brown eyes were studying me curiously, wearing an expression of grave concern. "Excuse me," she said to me in a German accent. "Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Greta Hoffmann. I'm a dermatologist from Frankfurt in Germany. I see that you have a mole on your back that looks very suspicious. If I were you, I would get it checked out at once." "You think it could be malignant?" I asked, looking horrified. "Let's just say that I would have it checked out if I were you." "Thank you," I said. "Thank you so much for telling me. It's a pleasure. I hope that it is nothing to worry about." "What was that all about?" my friend asked, having seen me engaged in a conversation with the German tourist. "What did that woman say to you? I saw your face growing as white as a sheet." "She was warning me about this mole I've got here on my back," I exclaimed, showing it to her. "The woman is a dermatologist from Frankfurt in Germany. She says I need to get it checked out. She says it looks suspicious. She freaked me out, I'm telling you that." My friend examined my mole. "Well, it does look a bit odd. It is uneven and misshaped, and it has got different shades of colour to it." Suffice to say, that evening in our hotel room, I spent the entire night looking up information about malignant melanomas. I began to realise that my mole looked uncannily similar to the visual examples that had been displayed. I could see my friends' anguished, worried looks as they encouraged me to cut my holiday short in order to get my mole examined by an expert. "Please go home," they begged me. "You need to get that mole checked out as soon as possible." So unfortunately that glorious holiday spent in the sunshine with my two best friends was ruined for me. All I could think about was returning to West Virginia and booking an appointment to see a dermatologist as soon as I possibly could. My dermatologist took one look at my mole and cut it out. The tissue biopsy was then sent to a laboratory. I was to soon learn the dreadful news that I did indeed have the dreaded malignant melanoma. It hit me hard like a kick to the guts. It felt as if my whole world had fallen apart. I was completely dumbfounded. If it hadn't been for that random encounter on the beach with that dermatologist from Frankfurt, I may never have had the mole checked out at all. I could be walking around obliviously unaware that a rampant cancer was growing inside me. A week later, I was sitting in a hospital waiting room for my turn to see the doctor. I glanced around at all the people waiting to see him first, and pondered if they also had cancer. People were just staring into space absently, their faces devoid of any expression. I wondered what they were going to see the surgeon about. What kind of thoughts were whirling around their mind? Were they afraid like I was? I'd never for a moment believed that cancer would ever brush my life. It was something that invariably always happened to other people, but not to me. But now I was beginning to realize that I was as vulnerable as the next man to getting ill. When I entered the waiting room after speaking to the receptionist on duty and registering my appointment with her, I couldn't help but notice a headboard on the wall of handwritten letters and cards, all written to the doctor that I was about to visit. I had a glimpse at some of the cards out of a heightened curiosity. "Dear Dr. Miller, I want to thank you for all you did for my mother while she was alive." And another note had read, "Thank you for improving the quality of my sister's life after her melanoma diagnosis." After that, I couldn't read any more notes. They screamed in my head like ambulance sirens. I was now petrified about what the doctor was going to tell me. It would seem that being diagnosed with malignant melanoma was really, really serious stuff. The receptionist called out my name. "Pamela McGee?" I looked up and nodded, putting down the magazine I'd been pretending to read for half an hour, which was on a page where there was an ad for a protein powder for men guaranteed to grow your pecs 3 times the size. I cast the magazine to one side and got up from my seat. "The doctor will see you now," she said. I nodded and managed to stand up. Every part of me was wobbling with anxiety. I took a deep breath and made my way to the doctor's office, terrified of what I was going to be told. How bad was my melanoma? That was the million-dollar question. For a moment I was relieved to see that the doctor wasn't there yet. I took a seat at his very grandiose, worn-out desk, graced by a family-framed portrait of a woman and kids smiling brightly in the lens. I glanced at the walls. They were heavily laden with impressive medical certificates that were meaningless to me, but I suppose very impressive. Obviously this doctor knew his stuff, so I was in good hands, if that was any consolation. Then I saw him. He was tall, dark and slender. He entered the room and made his way to the desk, taking a seat. He was a very smart, elegant man, turned out in a stylish pinstriped shirt and cream pants, with smart leather shoes. "Good morning," he said. "I'm Dr. Miller. Pleased to meet you." "You are?" "I'm Pamela McGee." "That's right. I have your name here on the file. You're Pamela McGee. You're 23 years old." "That's right." There was a long drawn-out silence as I watched the doctor read through my file. He looked up at me, his steely grey eyes meeting mine, and said, "Why did you leave it so long?" "You mean the mole?" I asked flatly. He nodded. Oh my God! I thought he was about to tell me that the cancer had spread all over my body. I felt as if I was swallowing a soccer ball as I choked out the words. I didn't even notice it. It was on my back. Someone pointed it out to me at the beach. "Good thing they did," said the doctor. "I hate to have to tell you this, but you have stage 3 melanoma." "What does that mean?" "It means that we need to operate to remove some lymph nodes to see if the cancer has spread anywhere else in your body. From then we will know what protocol to follow. We will also be removing extra tissue around the site of the melanoma to ensure that we have extracted all the cancer so that nothing will spread." "Will I have a large hole on my back?" "That should be the least of your worries, young lady, but a cosmetic surgeon will help in ensuring that your scars are inconspicuous. We will make it as neat as possible for you." That had happened a whole year ago. Time certainly flies by fast. I'd been incredibly fortunate. Luck had been smiling down on me, as after an operation followed by rigorous testings on their findings after surgery, it would seem the cancer had not reached my lymph nodes, so I was now declared cancer-free. But of course I did need regular checkups to ensure I didn't have any other cancerous moles or growths. So when I was about 30 years old, my job in Charleston, West Virginia, had become incredibly flexible, which meant I could work from home. So I decided to move to my grandmother's farm, an hour from Charleston. She had built a little cottage on the farm so that I could live in the countryside with them, but also have my own space and independence. The cottage was so beautiful. It had been built in a prime location overlooking a silvery pond, where all kinds of stunning bird and waterfowl would congregate. After my scary experience with malignant melanoma, I'd come to realize what the most important things in life are. Cancer has a way of putting things in perspective for you, making you access what really counts in your life. It was a marvellous idea that had been my grandmother's suggestion, as I'd grown up on that farm with both of my grandparents. As far as I was concerned, It was the most magical place in the entire world, where all my finest, most beautiful memories were birthed. I'd grown up without a father, as my mother claimed that on a trip to Paris she had met a Frenchman, drunk way too much, and spent an evening of passion with him. It was only when she returned to America that she discovered she was pregnant with me, but she had no way of tracing down my real father. So I can safely say that I'm possibly half French. While I was growing up, my mother was gallivanting around the globe as an international photographer, taking pictures of world events from war-torn parts of the world to exotic places. She took pictures for newspapers and glamorous publications like National Geographic. Due to my mother's high-profile career, I barely got to see her, and in truth I consider my grandmother to have been the real role model in my life, for she was there for me, whenever it really mattered, to nurse the scrape on my knee when I took a tumble, or to calm me down with a glass of warm milk when I was having a nightmare. My mother breezed into my life like a captivating, exotic, colourful butterfly that darts from flower to flower and then flies away. It's an age before you see that butterfly again, even though you never forget it, as it makes an indelible impression on you that you simply can't forget. She would bring us fabulous gifts from far-flung, isolated foreign and uncharted locations that she visited, but then she would be gone again. It was like she had itchy feet. She could never stay still for very long. She loved nothing better than embarking upon a new adventure, and our lives in West Virginia held little allure for her. My grandparents' magnificent farm was situated on about 40 acres of sprawling land, with open flowering meadows where cows and horses would graze happily and frolic in the fields. They also owned a plethora of ducks and chickens, and 2 devoted collie dogs that followed my Gramps wherever he went. We lived in an area where many other farms like ourselves also kept horses and cows. We called the old farmhouse a walk in the clouds farmhouse, as we considered home to be such a dreamy place, a place where you could unwind and be yourself, a place where harsh judgments and callous criticisms abandoned you, a place where you were loved and accepted for being you. It was a double-storey symmetrical brick and stone building with whitewashed walls, a terracotta roof and pretty sash windows that was built against these high undulating tree-covered hills, overlooking mesmerising panoramic views of the countryside, where beyond the expanse of flowery meadows where the horses and cows convened, you would see verdant fields and clusters of trees, where they gathered together in congenial groups like old friends. We also had a couple of silvery ponds surrounded by weeping willows, covered in pretty water lilies. On the right-hand side of our property the woodgrove stretched back for miles, where it continued beyond an old logging road. It was in this area that you would find the indigenous wildlife, from American beavers, chipmunks, foxes, river otters, red and grey foxes, cottontail rabbits, snowshoe hares, possums, voles, bobcats, coyotes, white-tailed deer, and the list goes on. Most of these animals have crossed my path from time to time, so I was fully aware of the vast array of vibrant indigenous wildlife that we had living among us. My grandmother was a very endearing old woman with a warm southern convivial charm and strong old-fashioned values. She ran that farm so smoothly, getting up at the crack of dawn to attend to her farm duties, like feeding the chickens, mucking out the stables, attending to the cows. And age was no barrier or hindrance to her. She was as fit as a fiddle, with the constitution of an ox, as she never got ill. While my grandfather enjoyed spending time out of doors, managing the affairs of the farm, and enjoying a spot of hunting from time to time, he had a particular affinity to bow hunting. One day I remember the next-door neighbour came to visit us. I think I was about 15 years old at the time. Her name was Nellie. She always popped around to our house for a cup of tea and a good old chinwag. That was what we did back then. Her truck rolled down our driveway. The woman got out of the door, slamming it behind her. Nellie was a woman in her early 40s, of a stocky build. She wore her hazel-brown hair in a pigtail, while her flawless sun-kissed skin had never worn a stitch of makeup a day in her life, not even on the day she married her husband Jed. Some said she should have been born a man, as she was all tomboy and loved nothing better than getting her hands dirty. She liked doing all those man jobs like working under engines and getting her overalls coated in oil, and her face smeared with black marks. She was always a cracking shot with a rifle, and considered a phenomenal hunter. I don't believe there was ever a time when I saw her wearing a dress. She always wore jeans and plaid shirts, and was constantly wearing her husband's clothes. We noticed she came to our front door hobbling on a crutch this morning. She was wearing an impressive plaster cast on her foot, which we couldn't wait to sign with our colourful pens, as you did that in those days. You could scrawl cute little messages on plaster casts of any kind, so that by the time you had the cast removed, it was covered in messy scribbles. My grandmother ran out of the door to help Nellie manoeuvre herself better by linking in with her free arm and guiding her into the farmhouse. "What happened to you?" my grandmother asked her. "I broke my ankle pretty badly," Nellie told us, "but believe me, it could have been a whole lot worse. I'm so lucky to be alive. It was a narrow miss, let me tell you." "Tell me about it, Nellie," said my grandmother, placing a kettle on the hob. "Don't keep us in suspense, will you?" "I'll wait for that cup of tea before I tell anyone anything. I'm gagging for a drink this morning." Nellie took a large gulp of sweet tea, and then began to compose herself. "The trouble is," she said, "what I'm going to tell you is so bizarre. I'm not entirely sure you're going to believe me, but it is the God's honest truth. I was ploughing the field with my husband's tractor, and I got the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. It was a weird feeling, but I brushed it to one side, telling myself that I was being ridiculous. The next thing I knew is that my tractor hit a tree limb, and I went flying off the vehicle while my tractor was still moving. I was moments away from being run over by the thing. Something like this has never happened to me before. I'm normally so careful with that top-heavy tractor. Everything was happening so quickly, too quickly for me to react. I landed on the ground really hard. I could hear the crack of my bone, so I knew that my ankle was broken. The pain was excruciating. I was seconds away from being run over when I found myself being scooped up into these very long, hairy arms, where I was put out of harm's way on the far edge of the field. This thing that rescued me was like a huge, massive, bulky form of dark brown hair. I had no idea what it was. My tractor was still driving itself, so this powerful beast pushed it over on its side so that it became inoperable. I mean, who can push a tractor over like that, I ask you? The creature then glided over to me to check that I was all right. I was in a state of suspended shock, as I realized that without this anomalous creature's intervention, I would almost certainly be dead or very, very seriously injured. "What do you mean, huge, massive, bulky form of brown?" asked my mother. "This was the thing that rescued me," Nellie exclaimed. "This was the thing that saved my life. But what it was, I couldn't tell you." "Well, what was it?" asked my grandmother. "Well, I've no idea," said Nellie. "It looked to be half human. It was big. This thing was easily over 8 foot tall, 3 foot wide. It had overlong arms and a pyramid-shaped head. But the face on this thing was so human. The only way I can describe him to you is he was like a wild man in every regard, but so intelligent, very, very, very clever." "What happened next?" asked my grandmother. "Well, I tried to get up onto my feet, but I couldn't. My ankle was literally dangling off my foot. And when the strange creature saw my foot, he let out a shrill whistle, as if to say, 'Wow!' It wasn't a pretty sight at all. In truth, it was really rather grisly. The creature picked me up in his substantial-sized arms and carried me to the farmhouse like a baby. He ran with me so gently, the ride was so smooth, he didn't jolt me once, nor did he appear to find me heavy. He put me down gently at the front doorstep, studying me through his dark eyes. Those eyes were so incredibly kind. It was as if he was saying, 'Are you going to be all right if I leave you here on your own?' I knew my husband was out with the cows, so I perceived he'd be a while. So I pointed to my son's famous 5 book that was lying further away on the ground. The creature brought it to me. He looked at the book and the picture on the front, scratching his head as if he was wondering what the thing was. I said, 'Thank you for helping me.' I mean, what else could I say? The creature grunted. I do think he sensed my appreciation. I watched him gliding from the green grass of our yard, through the flowery meadow towards a cluster of trees, and then he vanished from my sight. But he moved with such a grace. I then opened my son's Enid Blyton book and began to read it. I knew it would be a while before my husband returned from working with the cows. My ankle was throbbing, but I soon forgot about it, and when my husband returned I couldn't even put that Enid Blyton book down. It was so good. I was completely gripped by the plot. He looked at my foot and asked what the hell had happened to me. I told him my bizarre story, and well, let's just say he looked incredulous. "Well, I never," he kept saying. "Well, I never." He insisted I needed to go to the hospital at once. And well, let's just say the rest is history. "But I don't understand," Why weren't you afraid of the strange creature that rescued you? By all accounts, it was massive. You don't even know what it was." I didn't have time to be afraid. Everything happened so fast, like it does in a road traffic accident. It felt like a long time, but in reality it only took a few seconds. I couldn't even meditate on anything that was happening to me. The creature had whisked me up in his arms. It felt surreal, as if I was caught up in a dream. So I guess my ability to react was suppressed, as it is when you're in a dream state. But when I realized that this thing was helping me, I wasn't afraid anymore. When my grandfather came home that night for dinner, my grandmother could not wait to tell him about Nellie's remarkable story. "You're not going to believe it, Johnny, but I've got a weird tale for you that you're going to find so shocking." "I'm not easily shocked, woman," my grandfather teased, as he tucked into his mashed potato and chicken casserole. "Out with it. Let's see if you can ruffle the feathers of your man, shall we?" Well, Nellie fell off her tractor when she was ploughing. She bumped into some old tree fall and went flying over the tractor, landing in its path. The tractor was about to roll over her, but this humanoid hairy creature rescued her. It even disengaged the tractor and literally pushed the whole thing over. Imagine how strong you have to be to do that. "I've seen one of those hairy creatures," my grandfather said, "on this very farm when I was a young boy." "So you believe Nellie's story?" "Without a doubt." He pushed his food away and pulled out his pipe and began to smoke. "I grew up on this farm as a young boy. I've seen things I can't explain. But one day when I was about 8 years old, I remember seeing this tall, shadowy silhouette walking in the creek. It was so big, on closer inspection I realized I was seeing a giant hairy man. This thing was ginormous. He was literally diving under the water, using his bare hands to catch a fish. I was watching him enthralled from behind a tree. I remember thinking that I'd tried that stunt before, on many occasions. There is no way that a giant could catch a fish with his bare hands. Why do you think we have bait, nets, fishing rods, even spears? Because fish are not that easy to catch, that's why. I was astounded because this hairy giant was so fast he grabbed a large fish from under the water. It was thrashing around in his hands. He whacked the wiggling fish against his chest, and it stopped moving. And then he paddled to the edge of the creek and sat on his haunches on the ground and began to tear the fish apart in his hands and to eat it raw. I was so stunned, I quickly went back to call my brothers to show them what I'd seen. But by the time I returned to the creek, the hairy man had all but vanished. So my brothers thought I was making it all up. But I knew what I'd seen. I remember for weeks afterwards trying desperately to catch a fish under the water with my bare hands like he had done. But I couldn't. I even made a spear. But I didn't succeed. So in the end I had to resort to fishing with a rod. I never forgot that hairy man, or the way he caught that fish.
"So these hairy men are real?" my grandmother asked.
"They are real," my grandfather confirmed.
I'd forgotten all about this when I moved into the cottage on my grandparents' farm. I was able to work from home and only needed to pop into Charleston twice a week. It had been about 8 years since my melanoma scare. I'd long since forgotten about it and moved on with my life. One morning in early spring I was awoken to my alarm clock trilling away noisily. I slammed the pillow over my ear to block out the sound, but the damage had been done. I was wide awake. I audibly groaned as I saw the huge pile of paperwork I had to get through with the note in red, reminding me of the looming deadline. I've always been a bit of a procrastinator, so the idea of doing all that work made me feel nauseously sick. I made myself a cup of coffee, hoping that the caffeine in my system would somehow energize me. But no such luck. The paperwork on the desk looked about as appealing as a plate of chopped liver first thing in the morning. It had been a long, drawn-out winter, although here in West Virginia we don't take the same kind of beating for our winters as people in other states invariably do. I was marvelling at that twinkling sunshine glittering over the silvery pond. When I glanced out at the breathtaking view, and then at my paperwork, I just felt the tugging prickles of an overwhelming longing to go out into nature. I persuaded myself that I wouldn't be long. A quick walk in the fresh air would give me that va-va-voom that I needed to get back to my work when I returned,
as right now I felt as uninspired as a snail might feel on a frozen lettuce leaf. But after my walk, I would be rearing to go. Well, that's what I told myself anyway. I threw on a cotton top and a loose pair of cotton pants, and then off I went. I ebulliently bobbed out of the cottage with a feisty zealousness, the cool wind blowing against my face, my cheeks burning from its sweeping coolness. A smile emerged from my lips like the blossom from a closed bud as I entered the wooded sanctuary. It was so peaceful, so tranquil, as the shafts of warm spring sunshine darted hungrily through the trees, enveloping the woodland space in a soft ethereal light, the branches of the tree boughs swinging gently in the winds, many of their boughs heavily laden with a plethora of pretty springtime blossoms. The viridescent green floor sparkled like an emerald jewel, shimmering from the moist fragrant dew that powdered the ferns, the moss and the pretty spring shrubs in a fine wet spray, so that everything glittered, twinkled and sparkled in the soft light of the morning, as if every leaf and flower had been perfectly polished. I realized it must be earlier than I imagined. Perhaps my alarm clock had gone off prematurely, but it was so perfect being up this expeditiously in the morning. The songs of the dawn chorus burst through the woodland sanctuary, the pretty trills and warbles of the birds, such pleasing music to my ears, while the smells of wildflowers lingered in the air like a pretty bouquet. I moved through the woodland space, suddenly realizing I wasn't alone. I could feel eyes boring into my back. I turned around, studying the area where I was standing, but saw nothing there. Silly me, I told myself, as I moved forward into the forest. But with every single step, something else appeared to be following me. I turned around, stopping dead in my track. "Who's there?" I called. "Who's there?" But the echo of my own voice kept returning to me. It was then that through the veil of the green undergrowth and thin saplings that I saw a dark silhouette, and through the leaves a pair of brown eyes appeared to be studying me. They looked like liquid pools of warm treacle. There was nothing cold or aggressive about those eyes, but at 8 feet off the ground, this thing was hugely intimidating, so my level of comfort was expunged from me. I turned around to make hasty tracks back to the house, as whatever this was that was watching me from the shadows, it was enormous. I turned around as a little pebble was flung at my back. I realized this creature was following me. I sensed its energy was playful, almost mischievous, but I wanted to get out of the forest as fast as I could, as my anxiety had escalated. The next thing I knew, that was in my desperate attempts to leave the woods, I had stumbled ungracefully and fallen over a knotted root in the earthen floor. I could hear running feet pounding the ground as they hurried towards me. It seemed like the ground was vibrating, heaving and shaking as the creature neared its approach. I was trying desperately to raise myself off the ground when the benevolent creature that had been following me glided through the shadows like a ghost, and was mindfully hovering over me, as earnest golden eyes studied me from 8 foot off the ground, wearing an expression of bewilderment on its leathery human-like face. I imagine I must have appeared like a lumbering, clumsy, cloddish idiot to this anomalous creature. I was astonished when he helped me off the ground by reaching out his hand to me. I took it. It was warm, slightly damp, incredibly strong. I could feel the power in those fingers. I thought I had to be dreaming. I was lifted up the ground with a gentle tug. The creature did something very strange with his hand. He moved the skin at the back of my arm towards the front. His flat aquatic nose began to sniff the area. He took several sniffs and began to grunt. He looked up at me and pointed to the spot on my arm, as if he was seeing something bad there. The way he was wrinkling his nose told me that he wasn't pleased by what he had found. I lifted my arm up to examine the area that the creature had been pointing at, and there on my skin was another ominous mole, like the one that a German tourist had spotted on me years before on Venus Beach. But now a strange outlandish creature had sensed something was wrong with the mole on the back of my arm, and had alerted me to the problem. Maybe he had noticed it when he was following me in the woods, after he had raised me to my feet. All of a sudden a shrill whistle permeated the forest. The creature immediately responded to the sound with a similar whistle back. I knew that sound so well. I thought it was from the birds, but I realized now differently. He looked at me and gave me a firm nod. He glided away. So there I was again, sitting at the doctor's office being asked why I'd left it so long. as of course the mole at the back of my arm had been identified as another malignant melanoma. But once again it was stage 3 cancer. It hadn't spread to my lymph nodes. I was very lucky indeed, and declared cancer-free. The trouble was both my moles were in inconspicuous places that I would never have spotted myself if it hadn't been for a random tourist who happened to be a dermatologist and an outlandish creature I now know to be a Bigfoot. I marvel that a creature like that would know that there was something wrong with that mole, which it smelt with its nose. But then dogs can also smell cancer, so maybe it's not so strange after all. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Paisley Catkins was my grandmother. She lived in a tiny, whimsical little white brick cottage in the middle of the woods in the bluegrass state of Kentucky. She was an independent, self-sufficient woman who had lived on her own most of her life, as her husband died in his early 30s after contracting a bad bout of pneumonia. I had grown up in Houston in Texas and had little contact with my grandmother, so I knew very little about her, as she never turned up for family Christmases or Thanksgivings, but preferred to remain exactly where she was, favouring the solitude of the natural world than being with the family. Every year she would send me a beautiful knitted sweater, but I had never actually met her. When I was 14 years old, my mother suggested I go and stay with her for a while. "My mother's a bit of a loner," she admitted to me, "somewhat of a recluse, but I think it would be fabulous for you to become acquainted with her, as me and your father are going on a business trip together. This would be the perfect time for you to go and stay with her." "But what if she doesn't want me there?" I protested. "I mean, she shunned every family invite for Christmas and Thanksgiving, so she clearly doesn't want family around." "It's complicated," said my mother. "I wouldn't say shunned, I'd say politely declined." "It's the same thing, isn't it?" I piped. My mother was chopping carrots on a wooden board in the kitchen for the casserole that she was preparing. She handed me some tomatoes to slice for the salad. My mother never stopped chopping for a moment, but she did look reflective. "You know, your grandmother didn't have an easy life growing up as a young girl. She was the eldest of 3 children, very different to her 2 other sisters. She was creative, individualistic and imaginative. They were studious and academic. It seemed that her mother favoured the other 2 siblings over her oldest daughter, fussing over them all the time, buying them fabulous things, but just ignoring her oldest. She would come home having shopped with her 2 younger children, always leaving Paisley out, who would be left at home all on her own. They would return home to show my mother what they'd bought, but my mother never got a single thing. Can you imagine how that would make you feel, seeing your siblings spoilt rotten, but you get nothing? She said sometimes she felt as if she was watching her family through a glass pane, as if she didn't exist. She felt like a ghost in her own household. Just imagine that. "That's disgusting," I said. "So unfair. Blatant discrimination. What kind of a mother behaves like that?" Of course it distressed my mother, because such favouritism meant she felt as if she wasn't good enough, and there was something wrong with her. But she grit her lip and got on with her life, accepting the status quo. When she got older, she asked her mother if she could borrow money to buy something smart for a job interview that she was applying for at a pharmacy. Her mother refused to even loan her the money. But when the youngest daughter asked for a dress the very same day for a barbecue the following weekend, of course the mother didn't flinch and bought her daughter that dress. Your grandmother never forgot the injustice of that. It was like a kick in the teeth to her. My mother said that it was the teachers at her school that would go on and on about her. What an exceptional young girl she was. So creative, so talented. But her mother failed to see it. Instead, her mother complained bitterly that the teachers weren't complimenting her 2 other children. Why did they keep going on about Paisley, when it was her other 2 children that were the stars, she would say begrudgingly. It sounds a bit like a Cinderella story. I hadn't thought about it like that. I believe my mother's childhood and the way her own family distanced themselves from her was the reason that she withdrew from people, which explains why she doesn't interact socially, prefers her own company. "I get it now," I said. "I mean, who'd want to hang around people who are looking down on you? It's so much better to be alone in that case. That's why, sweetheart, never judge someone else's actions, because sometimes their actions are born from a place of hurt. But are you sure my grandmother would want me around if she's as reclusive as you say?" Her grandchild? Heavens, yes. She'll be delighted to see you. She's a lovely lady. You will really, really like her. I was naturally excited to meet my grandmother, who'd been spoken about so warmly by my mother on multiple occasions, but I'd never had the privilege to meet her. As for her mysterious cottage in the woods, it had been a purchase of my grandmother's in more recent years. My mother had been absolutely appalled when she'd learnt the news. "Why would you buy a house in the middle of the woods?" she complained. "It's not safe for an old woman like you to live on your own like this in a remote area. What if you have a nasty fall, or you get bitten by a snake? Who's going to help you? Regina, you do worry your head way too much. If I get bitten by a snake and succumb to its lethal venom, I'm okay with that. It means that that's the way the good Lord wants me to go. I'm not going to live a life tucked away in a suburban suburb. I want to be close to nature. If it means that I'm taking risks, then so be it. I'd rather live a fulfilling life than a safe one. Besides, I won't be living too far away from town." "But, Mum—" "No buts, dear. This is my decision to make, not yours." I remember the day the taxi drove me to Grandma Paisley's home. The truck drove down the smooth ribbon of asphalt, taking a left-hand turn onto a dusty red road, where the rubber tyres lifted up the powdery dust in the air that was causing us to cough and splutter in the taxi. Then it took a swift right-hand turn onto a long bumpy road that was filled with potholes and covered in rocks, where it wobbled precariously, jolting up and down. There was a wide opening in some trees where the truck finally entered, and there, bang in the middle of this wooded sanctuary, surrounded by clusters of red maples, serviceberries and oak trees, was the prettiest house that I've ever seen. It would seem the light from the forest canopy twinkled and sparkled through the trees, dancing over the contours of the house in pretty ethereal shafts of light. It was like the whole house glistened and gleamed. It was a very cute house with a stone facade and brick walls all painted in white. The ornate, stylish front door was an electric blue colour. It was so bewitching and charmed, something that wouldn't have looked out of place in a Hans Andersen fairy tale. "Nice place you've got here," said the taxi driver. "This dreamy cottage is pure poetry. But that bloody road to get here is one hell of a liability. I'm dreading the drive back. Are you going to be all right? Do you want to check if someone's in or not?" "No, I'll be fine," I assured the taxi driver, thanking him, while he removed my suitcase from the trunk. I watched him driving away. His truck groaned, heaved, jolted and wobbled down that obstacle course of a road, until he was nothing but a dot in the distance. I walked to the front door and tapped it gently. It creaked wide open. "Anyone there?" I called, but there was no answer. I entered the unpretentious cottage, was greeted to a cheerful, cosy, mellow interior, designed for comfort in every regard. It was simplistic, homely, but stylish, with soft, cushy white leather couches, bright, colourful scatter cushions in warm, rich reds, golds, oranges and burgundies. There were fluffy white rugs strewn generously over the gleaming, polished oakwood floors, the perfect place to nestle cold feet on bitter, chilly winter nights. There were fireplaces with marble mantels in virtually every room, including the living area. The main living area boasted floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, bursting at the seams with interesting, fascinating-looking books, while the butter-coloured walls were covered in sumptuous tapestries, enchanting pictures of woodland scenes, and profusive, ornate-looking mirrors, while the sash windows looked out onto spectacular views of the statuesque emerald-green forest. The glass sliding doors in the living room opened out into a well-appointed wraparound porch that was comfortably decked out with swanky upholstered chairs and a prodigal round oakwood dinner table. It rarely overlooked the most stunning stream with a natural waterfall where the exuberant fountains of fast-moving opaque water with creaming white froth crashed down the rocky cliff face to the pools of water below. "Hello, dear," came a soft voice. I turned around to see my grandmother, who was smiling at me, a warm, bright, sunny smile. She dashed over to me lovingly, enveloping me in her arms with a generous, warm hug. "Let's have a look at you," she said, stepping back. "Let me see. Yes, you do rather remind me of your mother when you were her age. The same petite bone structure, the long, dark black hair, the pretty blue eyes. But you're also strikingly different in another way. Maybe it's your energy, I'm not sure," she said indecisively. "I can't quite fathom what it is, But never you mind, I'll soon work it out. My grandmother was a woman in her 80s, although I never did find out her exact age. I knew better than to ask such an indiscreet question. She was a petite woman of over 4 foot tall, with a full head of white, buoyant, curly hair, and the brightest blue eyes I've ever seen, that sparkled with a lively, animated energy. Her paper-thin, delicate skin was well creased, with many crinkled expression lines around the contours of her wizened eyes. There were time-worn furrows on her forehead. She was dressed in a stylish pair of contemporary white cotton pants, with a sophisticated soft pink cashmere cardigan, with a vertical line of elegant pearl buttons that was complemented by a chic string of pearls that she wore around her neck, while her tiny little feet were decked out in an ultra-modern pair of white pumps. She looked tastefully dressed, elegant but casual. So what do you think of my quaint, rather twee fairy tale cottage tucked away in the heart of the woods? Isn't it so idyllic? I think it's beautiful, I agreed, but living out here on your own, surely you get lonely. Not really, dear. When you get to my age, you crave peace and quiet. You cherish tranquillity. I love nothing better than being close to the trees and the water. It energizes my spirit. I do make regular trips into town to stock up on supplies. I visit the church every Sunday. So no, I'm not lonely. No, I'm never lonely. That evening my grandmother and I sat around a cosy crackling fire in the living room, watching the flames crackle and spit. It felt as if we'd known each other all our lives. She was so easy to be around, informal, uncomplicated, warm-hearted, benevolent, the kind of person that is energizing and uplifting, rather than draining and exhausting. I felt serene, complacent, placid around her, as I did with the trees in my yard at home and around my cat Molly, who was always unconditionally loving. Perhaps it was also that she had no expectations in me, but accepted me as I was, while my parents were always looking for ways that I could improve myself. It was fall, and so there was a bracing chill in the air, and the crackling fire enveloped us in a cosy warmth. That was when I asked my grandmother if there was any time that she had been afraid living out here in the woods, and then she told me her remarkable story. My grandmother took a neat sip of her sherry, paused for a moment, wringing her fingers together. "Are you sure you want to hear this?" "Absolutely certain," I said. All my life I fantasized about living in the woods. For some reason, I've always been drawn to the trees, so I was on the lookout for acquiring a property that fit the bill. I contacted a number of estate agents to let them know exactly what I was looking for. I said I wanted a little white brick and stone quaint little cottage situated in the middle of the woods, overlooking the water. And you know what they said to me? I shrugged my shoulders. No. What did they say? "I'm sorry, man, but it's most improbable that you will find anything exactly like that. So you might consider compromising, settling for a wooden cabin, perhaps." I said absolutely not. It must be a small white cottage built from brick and stone. Of course, they went through the motions of humouring me. They said they'd be in touch if they found anything that fit the description. But I could tell by the bland, uninspiring, lifeless tones in their voices that they had me down as a finicky, fussy, cantankerous customer that wasn't easily satisfied and would be very difficult to please. Weeks passed and I never heard so much as a dicky bird from the estate agents, so I phoned them up again, asking them whether they had any luck in finding my white cottage. One of the estate agents, a delightful young lady called Victoria Pierce, said, "How do you know about the white cottage? It's only come on the market today. When did you say you'd like to see it?" I made an appointment with the woman to see the cottage. The moment my truck drove down this driveway, gliding through the trees, I gasped in astonishment when I saw this whimsical, quaint, quirky white cottage. I was transfixed to see that it mirrored the idiosyncratic cottage I'd been dreaming about years before. It was as if the perfect picture of my dreams had morphed into our reality. I mean, how was that even possible? I was flabbergasted and confounded. "You mean the cottage was exactly the same as the one you had been hoping to acquire? The one you'd visualized owning in your mind's eye?" "Exactly the same, right down to the tiny details of the blue front door." I remember I just stood there gawking, staring at the cottage as if I'd seen a ghost. The estate agent got out of her truck. She walked over to me. I was so bedazzled and enamoured by the cottage, I barely noticed her standing there. "Are you all right, madam?" she asked me. "You look as white as a sheet. Can I get you a glass of water?" Naturally, I assured her I'd be fine, but after a quick look around the cottage, I told her I would take the place at its asking price. I wasn't about to negotiate for something I wanted. Negotiation always comes with a risk. I wasn't about to take a risk. I knew I must have the cottage. That was when the estate agent revealed the bad news to me. She told me that the eccentric old lady that lived at the cottage was not willing to sell the house to anyone. She would need to interview the buyer first before she gave the all clear for the sale to go ahead. As you can imagine, I was gobsmacked by this outlandish expectation. The agent said to me, "I'll be completely straight with you. 3 years ago, this capricious old lady put her cottage on the market. Dozens of people put in offers for the unorthodox little place. The old lady insisted on interviewing all of them before she agreed to sell, and none of the potential buyers met with her approval. I'm telling you this," she told me, "as I don't really fancy your chances in acquiring the cottage, given what happened last time. The woman is very strange." Naturally, I knew I had nothing to lose. I mean, this cottage existed in my dreams. Surely it was meant for me. It was arranged that I would meet the lady of the cottage for afternoon tea that day. "I want to tell you, my dear," said my grandmother, squeezing my arm tightly. I was so terrified. I've been nervous before in my life, on many occasions, for interviews, exams, important occasions, but not like this, never like this. I was trembling as I arrived at the cottage doors, my knees buckling beneath me, while in the back of my throat I had this huge lump. The old woman gestured me into the house. She was a slight woman, not too different from me now that I'm her age, actually. She wore very funky spectacles, shaped into butterfly wings in bright pink, and she wore bright pink lipstick and pink clothing. She looked at me intently and gestured for me to sit down on her pink ottoman, and then she asked me why I wanted to buy her cottage. I said, "I've seen it in my dreams. It's calling my name." She said to me, "It's possibly because it is. I think we can safely say I found the buyer for my home. Congratulations." "And that was it?" I asked. "That was it. I think the estate agent virtually had a heart attack when the old lady agreed to sell me the cottage. So I moved into the property forthwith, and for the first time in my life I felt like I belonged. A little like an old slipper going missing and being reunited with its other half. It was as if I'd always belonged here. One night after I retired to bed, I suddenly heard a banging sound, as if someone was pounding the house, as the vibration seemed to roll across the wooden floor, causing the furniture to rattle, and even my own bed began to wobble unsteadily. Then the front door was thrust violently off its hinges, and gusts of icy cold air came rushing through the house. I sat up in bed thinking, what the heck is going on? I remember my heart was thundering violently in my chest. My guts felt as if they'd been ripped out of my body. I began to panic. In seconds, 2 young men both barged into my bedroom. Their heads were covered in stockings. On the stockings they were wearing headlamps. They were pointing rifles at me, demanding me to show them where the money was. "Woman, take us to your stash of cash," they yelled. "Now!" I felt I'd woken up in the middle of a horror movie. It seemed all so surreal to me. I'd been half asleep, so to wake up with these 2 men yelling at me and pointing rifles in my face was bizarre, to say the least. I trembled as I climbed out of bed in my white nightgown, while the rifle was thrust violently in my back. I delicately scampered into the kitchen and pointed to the biscuit tin. "The money's in there," I said. They pulled out a few dollar notes and scattered them on the floor, screaming, "Is this a bloody joke, woman? We're not easily fooled. We didn't come here for pittance. Tell us where the rest of the loot is. We have it on good authority that you keep a sleeping bag stashed with lots of cash in this house. Thousands and thousands of dollars, we believe. You're scared of banks, aren't you? We want that money now. We know you've got it." "I don't keep cash in the house," I trembled. "But look around. You can take anything you want. But please, please don't hurt me." "Don't lie, woman. Word around town is that you do have thousands of dollars in a sleeping bag. Don't pull the wool over our eyes." "Well, maybe the previous owner did, but not me. I've only recently moved into this cottage. You must have your wires crossed. It's not me that's got thousands of dollars stashed away at home." They started to hit me with the back of their rifles. "Where's the loot?
they screamed. "If you don't tell us, we will kill you." I knew that this was not going to end well, as these men were volatile and unhinged. I started to think quickly on my feet. I told them I'd hidden the cash in the tool shed. Why I said that I can't really fathom. Maybe it was to stop them hitting me so hard, as they were really hurting me. My body was throbbing and aching with pain, and I was crying. My plan was to escape and hide somewhere in the woodgrove under the cover of darkness, where that would be my greatest opportunity to escape these brutal men. They marched me by the back of my shoulders to the tool shed. It wasn't too dark, as the moon was full and the stars plentiful, so visibility was excellent. They thundered around the tool shed, rooting through everything. "Where is the loot, woman?" they screamed. "Show us now." I acted vague, indeterminate, confused. I pretended my memory was foggy, which made them exceedingly mad with me. I don't remember. I do remember I put it somewhere here, but I can't remember. It's somewhere around here." They kept hurling insults at me. They began to tear the tool shed apart, looking in tins, old baskets, boxes, you name it, thrusting them out of the shed into the yard, where they littered everything with chaos and old paint cans, yard tools and camping equipment, literally peppered the ground. They were kicking things with their feet violently, ripping everything up in sight. Regretfully, I didn't have a chance to escape, as one of the men kept his steely eyes pinned on me. I was scared of them not getting what they were looking for, as I could see they were becoming murderous in their rage. Their anger was escalating every passing second. "Don't get any funny ideas, woman. If you so much as try to escape, it's a bullet in the head for you." "Why are you doing this to me?" I trembled. "Get over yourself, woman. It's nothing personal. We need the money." I promise you I knew those men wouldn't hesitate to shoot me. I was only glad they were wearing stockings on their head, as it meant that there was a possibility I could come out of this alive, as they were covering their identities, which could mean that they weren't intending to murder me. They wanted to make sure that I couldn't identify them. All of a sudden you could hear this thumping, crashing noise coming from the trees. The only way I can describe it was it sounded as if a huge train was hurtling through the woods towards us. I could hear tree limbs shaking, leaves rustling, branches breaking and cracking. The two men looked startled. They looked around themselves nervously. "What the heck is that?" they said. While the men were slightly distracted by the noise, I attempted to run away, but one of the men grabbed me by the collar of my nightgown so that I fell onto the ground. He stared at me with enraged eyes. "No, you don't," he shrieked. "There's no money, is there?" he said, growling. "You're leading us up the garden path, aren't you? There's no bloody money." I nodded. "I'm sorry. I told you I don't keep money in the house." "It's too late for sorries." He was about to kick me with his heavy combat boots. Then suddenly a dark silhouette came thundering towards us like a great big dense giant blob of black. The men both screamed, "Bloody hell! What the heck?" This dark humanoid being, shaped like a giant covered in hair, grabbed one of the men, hurling him up in the air like a Catherine wheel. The other man, on seeing what was happening to his friend, literally let out a shrill scream and began to run as fast as he could, not even waiting for his friend, as his only interest was in saving his own skin. He couldn't get away fast enough. While the bizarre creature continued to whirl the terrifying man in the air a couple more times, catching him in mid-flight like a frisbee. Then finally he put him on the ground. The man, now safely on terra firma, began to hightail it as fast as he could, away from the cottage. He began screaming, "It's a Bigfoot! It's a Bigfoot! Bloody hell, it's a goddamn Bigfoot! Get out of here! It's going to kill us!" The creature began mock-chasing him, releasing these ear-piercing screams, throwing rocks after the men. Once the men had gone, I was so stunned, confounded, and completely flabbergasted. I didn't know what to think, because whatever this creature was, he'd saved my life. I was shaking so much and trembling. The creature led me to a tree and got me to sit down against the tree trunk for support. The one thing I knew with absolute certainty was that those men would never be coming back, and they never did. But I didn't know who they were, or why there was a rumour in town that I kept a stash of money, thousands of dollars in a sleeping bag. "What?" I gasped. "The creature that saved your life? It was a Bigfoot?"
Now I know that to be the case. Back then I wasn't sure what it was. Yes, it was a Bigfoot. What did it look like, I asked. Well, this Bigfoot was about 8 foot tall with long flowing dark hair and a conical-shaped head. Truly, it looked like a giant human being covered with hair. Wow, I said. Did you ever see it again? It has a name, my grandmother told me. I call him Shadow. Are you saying that he's still around, I asked. If he is, will I meet him? Oh, I'm not sure about that, said my grandmother, looking at me honestly. Shadow knows you're here, as his kind know everything that's going on. They're very sensitive to changes in the environment. They know when a stranger's around, and when they do, they keep their distance. You see, when I moved into this cottage, the creatures got used to me, as they possibly did the old lady before me. I would hasten to say that I'm sure they had some kind of interaction with her, something she was not inclined to share with me, and rightly so. There are 3 Bigfoot living here. Shadow, his female partner, and a little youngling. Well, they're not like regular humans. They're exceedingly ambiguous, evasive, enigmatic, and elusive. In truth, I've only ever had fleeting glances of his female partner. She's so bashful, shy, and self-effacing. She often shrinks into the shadows behind the tree, watching me. Her youngling is equally as reticent and demure, but inquisitively curious nevertheless. Shadow is quite comfortable, complacent, and at ease in my presence, has often joined me when I've gone foraging for mushrooms and berries, and has helped me gather stuff. He often leaves me some rainbow trout on my front door, as he knows I love fish. He keeps a watch over the cottage all the time. I believe he sees the cottage, me, and these woods as his territory. So you mark my words, I'm safe here, as those creatures have my back. But as for you getting a glimpse of one of these creatures, I think it's highly unlikely. I was enjoying spending time with my grandmother and learning all about her life. I wanted to understand why she enjoyed solitude rather than interacting with people, as I was to understand that she didn't have many friends, but it seemed these guardians of the forest had become her unlikely companions. I awoke up one night to hear some whistling. The whistling was intent. It demanded my attention. I sat up and crept over to the window-sill. I could hear my grandmother open the front door. I looked out of the window. Luckily the moon was bright that night, so I could see Grandma Paisley standing next to this tall black creature that I realized must be Shadow. I could feel my heart thumping excitedly in my chest, for the hope of seeing Shadow had dimmed after my grandmother had told me it would be improbable that I would ever get to meet him. Yet I could see him clearly, larger than life, but my attention was focused on his leathery human-like face and the jubilant expression that he was wearing. Shadow appeared to be jumping up and down on his huge legs like an excitable dog, chattering away in a foreign language that I've never heard before, speaking incredibly fast. He kept pointing towards the woods. My grandmother slipped back into the house, grabbed her dressing gown, while she wrapped it around her frail form. She placed her head torch on her head, and she walked hurriedly after the creature. I wasted no time at all in throwing on my jeans and a sweatshirt and a pair of sneakers and dashing down the stairs out of the front door, where I was greeted by gusty, icy cold air. I chose to keep a safe distance behind my grandmother and Shadow, trying best not to be seen by them. The wind whistled through the trees, while fallen leaves floated in the wind like celestial butterflies. The boughs of the oak and maple trees seemed to move gently in the wind, as if they were dancing, while the crisp autumn leaves covered the forest floor in golden leaves. Even though there were no sounds from crickets or frogs, the woodgrove felt peaceful and tranquil. I crunched the leaves beneath my feet with every step. I had to be very cautious about being as discreet as I possibly could. I followed the duo into the woods, hiding behind trees at every given opportunity. It was then that I saw the female Bigfoot with her youngling at her side in a clearing in the woods. I stopped dead in my tracks, hardly daring to believe what I was observing. She was in the throes of giving birth. I could hardly believe it. She was squatting on the ground on her haunches, sweating, grunting and groaning as she started to push. She seemed surprised to see my grandmother on the scene, watching her, but I think the pain had abolished her fear. She almost welcomed the presence of another female. My grandmother moved cautiously towards the creature. The light of her headlamp enabled me to see it clearly. My grandmother reached for the creature's hand and squeezed it firmly in hers. It got lost in her big sausage-like fingers of the female, dwarfing my grandmother so much that she looked like a tiny doll next to the creature. Her bright brown eyes looked illuminated with excited anticipation and gratitude, as well as pain, all rolled into one. "Go on, you can do it," my grandmother urged. "Push, push. Come on, you can do it. Push," she kept saying. Her gentle words were encouraging, kind, reassuring. Shadow was in the corner watching the scene unfold, continuously jumping up and down on his legs. He was so excited. I've never seen anyone look that jubilant before. He looked like a proud father-to-be, as his bright, deep-set dark eyes set in his leathery face looked so enthused, while the youngling, a 4-foot-tall, lanky, thin male, appeared to be behaving exactly like his father. There was an exuberant electric buzz in the air. I realized my grandmother's calm energy must have been very stabilizing and soothing in this fired-up atmosphere, when some calm energy was gladly appreciated by the poor female. Finally, with one last anguished cry, a baby emerged from her womb, a grey-coloured creature with a fine scattering of black hair. There were rapturous whoops from the father and son, while the female creature severed the umbilical cord with a sharp stone. Then she gathered her baby in her arms, cradling her to her chest, her brown eyes filled with a mother's joy and pride. She patted the baby's back, and it let out a strange cry. My grandmother was saying, "Well done, girl! You did it! You did it!" She rubbed her hands on the creature's forehead to wipe away the sweat with her hands. "You did it, girl! Well done! You did it!" The Bigfoot mother looked absolutely thrilled. Her brown eyes sparkled with joy. She handed the baby over to my grandmother. Grandmother Paisley cuddled the baby in her arms. Tears were pouring down her face. "It's a girl! It's so beautiful! So beautiful!" I was so in awe of this magical, arresting scene that I moved away from the trees towards the Bigfoot and her baby. I wanted to hold the beautiful baby like my grandmother had done. For a second the Bigfoots were surprised by my presence, but nothing could dampen their enthusiasm. They graciously welcomed me into their circle of celebration. The mother handed me her baby to hold. I cuddled it closely in my arms. It looked upon me with the most intelligent, shining, warm eyes, and my heart melted like butter. After this incredible, awesome event, my grandmother was so moved that the Bigfoots had chosen to include us, well, rarely her, in the celebration of the birth of their baby. In the days that followed, the female creature would bring her baby girl to us so that we could cuddle the little thing. The act of giving birth had banished the female's former reticence. In the years that followed, my grandmother's relationship with the Bigfoot family grew very strong. My grandmother died 20 years ago, but this poignant memory of watching a mother Bigfoot give birth will forever stay with me, as it was one of the most moving experiences of my entire life. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.